What's up, guys? Welcome to Fanfic Empire. We've got something special today. What if baby Harry stumbled into Gringotts half dead and blood scan revealed Dumbledore sold him? Don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's dive in. Chapter 1. The child at the door. The rain came down hard over Diagon Alley that night, the kind of rain that didn't care where it fell, on cobblestones or flower boxes, on the shoulders of frightened witches hurrying home with their evening papers, on the bronze doors of Gringotts Bank, which had been closed since sundown and would not open again until 6 in the morning. It was just past midnight on the 1st of November, 1981. The wireless inside the leaky cauldron was running the same report it had been running for 3 hours. He who must not be named, vanquished, the Dark Lord gone, celebrations in the streets of Hogsmeade, in Diagon Alley, in wizard communities across Britain, and inside the pub. Tom the barman was pouring free rounds for people who were still crying from relief and people who had already moved past relief into something raucous and loud and a little bit unhinged. Nobody was looking out the windows. Nobody was watching the alley. Nobody saw the small shape moving along the base of the wall, just above the gutter where the rainwater was running fast and dark. A child. Barely more than a baby, 15 months old, moving on hands and knees because his legs weren't working right. His robes, the soft woolen kind that wizarding families put on their toddlers, cream-colored once, patterned with small golden snitches, were soaked through and black with something that wasn't rain. The left side of his face was burned. Not the theatrical, dramatic burn of curse fire, but the raw, weeping kind, the kind that came from proximity to magic so violent it scorched the air itself. His right hand was bleeding where he'd been crawling on broken cobblestones for God only knew how long. He didn't cry. That was the thing that would stay with the goblins later, the detail they would return to in their accounts of that night. He didn't cry. He moved with the focused, instinctual determination of a creature that had decided, at some deep wordless level, to survive, and was carrying out that decision one cobblestone at a time. His name was Harry Potter, though he didn't know that yet. On his forehead, half hidden by dark wet hair plastered flat by the rain, was a wound shaped like a lightning bolt, and it was still bleeding, still smoking faintly at the edges, and the magic coming off it was the most wrong thing that had ever been felt in Diagon Alley, like a chord struck on an instrument that had been designed for a completely different scale. The bronze doors of Gringotts were closed. But the goblin on night guard duty inside them felt something. Sharpclaw was 47 years into his posting at the Gringotts Night Gate and he had stopped expecting interesting things to happen approximately 46 years ago. His job was to sit behind the inner doors, monitor the wards, drink his cold tea, and observe the complete absence of anything worth reporting. He was very good at this job. So when the outer ward hummed, not an intrusion alarm, not a threat pulse, but the very specific harmonic that the ancient stones of Gringotts used to register significant magical presence in distress, he put down his tea and stared at the door for a long moment. The ward hummed again. Sharpclaw stood, adjusted his uniform, checked his blade out of professional habit, and approached the door. He opened the inner grille, then the secondary bolt, then he pressed his palm flat against the cold bronze of the main door and the locking charm recognized his handprint and withdrew with the deep clunk of very serious engineering. He pushed one door open, just enough to look out. The rain hit him immediately. He looked left. He looked right along the empty alley. Then he looked down. The child looked up at him. They stared at each other for a moment, the ancient goblin guard in his uniform and the soaking, bleeding toddler with the smoking wound on his forehead, and then the child reached up with one small, blood-crusted hand and grabbed the hem of Sharpclaw's uniform jacket. Sharpclaw had been in the goblin rebellions. He had worked 47 years on a night gate. He had seen dark curses, cursed objects, cursed people, exploding vaults, and one memorable incident involving a misfired engorgement charm and 3 barrels of goblin silver. He looked down at the tiny hand gripping his uniform. "Oh," he said, very quietly. Then he picked the child up, carefully, because the injuries were clearly severe, stepped back inside, and kicked the door shut behind him. What happened next moved fast, even by goblin standards, which valued efficiency the way wizards valued emotion, completely and without apology. Sharpclaw carried the child to the guard station and pressed the emergency summons. Within 4 minutes, 3 Gringotts healers arrived, goblin healers, who practiced a form of magical medicine that wizarding healers considered barbaric and goblins considered effective, and began their assessment without preamble or sentimentality. The child had a severe magical impact wound on his forehead, still magically active and resisting basic healing charms in a way that made the lead healer, a sharp-faced goblin named Iron Teeth, go very still and say quietly to her colleague, "Don't touch that one. Not yet." He had burns to the left side of his face and neck, proximity burns from high-order dark magic, consistent with being in the same room as a killing curse impact. He had a dislocated shoulder, 3 cracked ribs, and the kind of systemic shock that came from his tiny body absorbing a magical backlash that would have killed an adult wizard outright. He was alive. Inconveniently, impossibly, and very stubbornly alive. He was also completely unidentified. No tags. No family medallion. No guardian bond thread, which every wizarding child under 12 was supposed to carry as a matter of basic safety. Nothing. The child had arrived at the doors of Gringotts with nothing but injuries and that baffling, persistent, wrong signature on his forehead wound. "Unknown child," Iron Teeth said to Sharpclaw, who was still standing in the doorway looking slightly out of his depth, which for a goblin meant he was holding himself very still. "No identification. Significant magical injuries. We stabilize, and then we report to the duty master." "The duty master is Ragnarok tonight," Sharpclaw said. Iron Teeth paused for just a fraction of a second. "Then send for Ragnarok." Ragnarok, at that particular moment, was 3 levels below the main hall of Gringotts, standing in Vault Corridor 7 with a lamp, a ledger, and the particular expression of a goblin who had been doing quarterly reconciliation since 9 o'clock and was not grateful for the interruption. He was the chief vault master of Gringotts London. He was, by the internal hierarchy of the goblin nation, roughly equivalent to what a wizard would call a high judge combined with a finance minister combined with someone who could have you quietly ruined by Tuesday if you inconvenienced him before breakfast. He was not soft. He was not sentimental. He was the product of 200 years of goblin philosophy about the nature of value, contract, and the absolute sanctity of what was owed. He read the emergency summons note twice, folded it precisely, handed his ledger to his assistant, and walked back up to the surface without a word. When he arrived at the medical antechamber and saw the child laid out on the examination table, cleaned now, the worst of the blood rinsed away, one arm in a goblin-made binding splint, the terrible wound on his forehead dressed but still faintly smoking, he stopped in the doorway. "What is the injury source?" he asked. "Killing curse proximity," Iron Teeth said. "Possibly direct impact, deflected. The scar is magically active. Whatever hit this child, it didn't kill him, and it didn't fully leave." Ragnarok walked to the table. The child was awake, he realized. Those green eyes, extraordinary color, the kind of green that didn't come from ordinary genetics, the kind that looked like it had been decided by something, were tracking him. Watchful. Exhausted, clearly in pain, but watchful. "How old?" Ragnarok asked. 12 to 16 months, Iron Teeth said. Ragnarok looked at the child for a long moment. Then he looked at the absence of any identification, at the blank space where a guardian bond thread should have been, at the cuts on those small hands from a long crawl on rough cobblestones. "Run a blood inheritance scan," he said. Iron Teeth hesitated, not much, but enough that Ragnarok noticed. "That requires a drop of blood and the child's consent cannot be, the child is unidentified, injured, and in the care of Gringotts Bank. Under Section 12 of the Unaccompanied Minor Statute, our statute, not theirs, we have both the authority and the obligation to run it." He looked at her steadily. "Run the scan." A blood inheritance scan at Gringotts was not a simple thing. It was not the ministry's rough-and-ready lineage charm that wizards used for squib assessments or inheritance disputes. Gringotts had been running these scans for 900 years, and in that time they had developed something considerably more thorough, a 3-layer assessment that mapped not just parentage but active bloodline magic, dormant hereditary abilities, all standing inheritance claims, any existing magical contracts tied to the bloodline, and any outstanding oaths, bonds, or obligations attached to the subject. It was, essentially, a complete audit of a person's magical existence. It required a single drop of blood, a prepared silver basin, and the 9-syllable invocation that only a Gringotts vault master of the 3rd rank or above was permitted to speak. Ragnarok pricked the child's finger himself, gently, with a needle thinner than a hair, and let one small drop fall into the basin. The child watched the whole thing without flinching, which Ragnarok filed away without comment. He spoke the invocation. The silver in the basin went bright, then dark, then began to move, swirling up into shapes and lines and the particular script that Gringotts used for its inheritance records, cramped and precise and utterly readable to anyone trained in it. Ragnarok read. The room was quiet for a moment. Just the rain outside, just the sound of the healers moving softly behind him, just the child breathing in small careful breaths on the examination table. Then Ragnarok said, "Leave the room. Master Ragnarok, the child still needs, he is stable. Leave the room. All of you." He didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice. But something in the quality of the silence around his words made Iron Teeth and both assistants gather their instruments and go without another word. Sharpclaw, still in the doorway, met Ragnarok's eyes. "You too," Ragnarok said. "And lock the outer door." Sharpclaw left. The lock clicked. Ragnarok turned back to the basin. He read the scan again, slowly, word by word, the way you read something when you need to be absolutely certain you haven't made an error, when the stakes are high enough that misreading a single character would be unconscionable. He hadn't made an error. The child in front of him was Hadrian James Potter, son of James Charles Potter and Lily Juniper Potter née Evans, both deceased as of the previous evening. Heir by direct lineage to House Potter, one of the Sacred 28. Heir by blood adoption clause to House Black, Sirius Orion Black had, it appeared, filed a formal blood adoption declaration at Gringotts 18 months ago, making Harry his heir in the event of his death or incapacitation. Heir by dormant lineage to House Peveril, the oldest of the 4 lines, reaching back so far into magical history that the Gringotts records had to pull from the restricted archive to confirm it. And heir, by a bloodline nobody had activated in 3 centuries, to House Slytherin. Ragnarok set that particular item aside for later consideration, because there was something else in the scan. Something that shouldn't have been there. Something that the inheritance scan had flagged with the specific red border notation that Gringotts reserved for documents that constituted a legal irregularity of the most serious kind. It was a contract. Not an old contract. Not a historical debt or an ancestral obligation. This contract had been filed 14 hours ago. The ink, metaphorically speaking, was still wet. Ragnarok read the contract 3 times. Then he sat down on the healer's stool, something he could not remember doing in a professional context in the last 30 years, and read it one more time. The contract was a guardianship transfer agreement. Fully legal by ministry standards, which meant it had been filed with the Department of Magical Family Law, witnessed, and sealed. It transferred legal guardianship of Hadrian James Potter, with the full consent of his designated magical guardian, to one Petunia Yvonne Desley, née Evans, of No. 4, Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. The designated magical guardian who had signed over Harry Potter to a Muggle woman in Surrey was Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore. That would have been, on its own, merely an extraordinary overreach by a man who had appointed himself the arbiter of the wizarding world's fate. The guardianship of a minor witch or wizard was not, technically, within the authority of the chief warlock of the Wizengamot or the supreme mugwump of the International Confederation. James and Lily Potter had left a will. Gringotts held that will. Ragnarok had not yet read it tonight, but he knew from his own vault records that it existed, and that it named Sirius Black as primary guardian, Frank and Alice Longbottom as secondary. Dumbledore had bypassed all of it. He had filed a ministry contract. He had used his position as chief warlock, which gave him emergency authority over cases where the standard guardianship chain had been disrupted by dark activity, and he had transferred this child to a Muggle family before the bodies of the parents were cold, before anyone had searched for the named guardians, before anyone had even confirmed what had actually happened in Godric's Hollow. But that, too, was not the part that made Ragnarok sit down. The contract had a secondary clause. Most guardianship transfers were simple documents: name of child, name of guardian, terms of custody. This one had a secondary clause, written in the fine print that ministry family law documents hid in their appendices, and it read as follows: in exchange for the assumption of guardianship of the subject minor and the agreement to raise said minor in conditions of minimal magical exposure and reduced public profile, the party of the first part, APWB Dumbledore, agrees to render to the party of the second part, PY Desley, the following consideration: one-time payment of 200 galleons from the Potter Family Trust, Gringotts Vault 687, annual payments of 100 galleons from the same trust for the duration of the minor's residency, and the use of ministry obliviation services to resolve any inconvenient awareness of the arrangement among relevant parties. He had sold him. Not in the crude, criminal sense. It was legal, technically, horribly, bureaucratically legal, but Albus Dumbledore had taken a child who had just survived something unprecedented, whose parents were newly dead, whose named guardians were alive and had not been consulted, and he had paid a woman to take him and keep him away from the magical world and keep him ignorant, and he had taken the money to do it from the child's own vault. Ragnarok sat with this information for exactly 60 seconds. Then he stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked to the examination table. The child, Harry Potter, heir to 4 houses, ward of nobody, 15 months old and covered in injuries sustained in a magical cataclysm, was still watching him with those green eyes. "Your name," Ragnarok said, very quietly, "is Hadrian James Potter. You are the heir to 4 of the oldest bloodlines in the wizarding world. Your parents died last night. The man who was supposed to protect you sold you to strangers for 200 galleons and the use of a government memory charm." The child couldn't understand him. He was 15 months old. But those green eyes didn't waver, and something in Ragnarok's chest, some old, deeply buried thing that a goblin of his rank was not supposed to have and certainly not supposed to act on, made a decision that his brain was still catching up to. "Gringotts," he said, "to the room, to the stones, to the ancient magic threaded through the walls of this place like blood through a body, is owed a debt. This child was brought to our door. We did not turn him away. Under the law of ward right, which predates the ministry, which predates the statute of secrecy, which predates every piece of wizarding legislation that Albus Dumbledore has ever touched, this child is now a ward of Gringotts." He reached into his jacket and took out his personal seal, the Vault Master's seal, gold and goblin iron, the one that made contracts unbreakable. He pressed it to the discharge form on the examination table, and in the space marked Guardian Authority, he wrote, "Gringotts Bank, London. Ward right invoked. Senior Authority, Ragnarok, Chief Vault Master." He looked at Harry Potter. "Nobody," he said, "is selling you anywhere." By 2 in the morning, the Inner Council of Gringotts London had been summoned. There were 7 of them, not counting Ragnarok, and they arrived in the council chamber with the expressions of goblins who had been pulled from their beds or their night work and were reserving judgment about whether this had been justified. By the time Ragnarok finished speaking, which took 11 minutes, because he did not waste words even when the information he was conveying was extraordinary, the reservation was gone. In its place was something that moved across the council table like a cold wind off a glacier, the particular goblin anger that had no heat in it, only precision, only the absolute crystalline certainty of a wrong that needed to be answered. Goblins had a concept that didn't translate cleanly into English. The closest approximation was Drekater, the obligation of righteous correction. It was not vengeance. Vengeance was emotional. Drekater was structural. When a wrong was committed that violated the fundamental laws by which an ordered world operated, it was not enough to punish the wrongdoer. The structure that had allowed the wrong had to be addressed. The record had to be corrected. The debt had to be made visible. What Dumbledore had done was Dracadder on at least 3 separate counts. "The will," said Goldtooth, the eldest counselor, her voice like gravel in a mill wheel. "We have the will. Vault 687 records confirm it was lodged with us 18 months ago," said the records master, a younger goblin named Slatehand, who had spent the last 20 minutes pulling files with the focused urgency of someone who understood that the paperwork was, in fact, the weapon. "The will of James and Lily Potter names Sirius Orain Black as primary guardian of Hadrian James Potter. It names Frank and Alice Longbottom as secondary. It names 12 additional parties in tertiary order. Albus Dumbledore is not named anywhere in the will. He has no legal standing whatsoever to act as guardian or to appoint one. And yet he filed a ministry contract," said Iron Vault, the security master. "He filed a ministry contract," Slatehand confirmed. "Using emergency chief warlock powers. The emergency provision exists for cases where the standard guardianship chain is impossible to activate, for example, if all named guardians are dead or permanently incapacitated." "Sirius Black is alive," Ragnarok said. "As far as our records indicate, yes. The Black family vault has had no death notification filed. His Gringotts account is active." The silence in the room was the specific silence of people doing mathematics. "He doesn't know," said Goldtooth. "Or he's been prevented from acting." "Either way," Ragnarok said, "the ministry contract was filed fraudulently. The emergency provision was invoked without the conditions for that provision being met. The transfer of guardianship to the Dursley woman is legally void." He paused. "Under our law." "The ministry won't see it that way," Iron Vault said. "The ministry," Ragnarok said, "has not yet been asked what it sees. We have time before morning. I want the following done before Gringotts opens its doors." He looked at Slatehand. "Pull the Potter will. Have it witnessed and registered as active. Pull the Black Blood Adoption Declaration. Cross-reference both." He looked at Iron Vault. "I want ward right documentation prepared. Full historical precedent, the last 900 years of case examples. I want it watertight enough that when Dumbledore sends his lawyers, and he will send his lawyers, they will need a very long time to find a single crack." He looked at Goldtooth. "I want a communication drafted to the head of each of the 4 houses whose bloodlines are at stake. Black first, since he's the named guardian and someone needs to find out why he hasn't come for this child already." He looked around the table. "We also need to discuss the scar," he said. The room went quieter. Ironteeth's assessment was that it's magically active. Whatever curse hit this child, part of it is still in him. He chose his next words carefully. "Our curse breakers need to look at it before anyone outside Gringotts does. Because if I'm reading the inheritance scan correctly," and he had read it correctly, he was certain of it now, "the magical signature embedded in that wound is not random. It's tethered. And I will not have this child used as a leash for something that should be dead." The council absorbed this. "He's sleeping," Goldtooth said. It wasn't a question. Finally, Ragnarok said. "Iron Teeth says he fought it for about an hour after I left him. Kept trying to sit up." Something moved briefly across Ragnarok's face that might, in a human, have been called a smile but was more accurately described as a recognition of quality. "Stubborn," he said. "Good." The child slept in the Gringotts medical wing, in a cot brought in from the staff quarters because the examination table was not an appropriate place for a 15-month-old to spend the night, and the nearest bed suitable for a human child in Diagon Alley was in the back room of a closed apothecary, and technically they couldn't get to it without waking the owner and explaining the entire situation, which they were not prepared to do at 2:30 in the morning. Iron Teeth had cleaned and dressed all the wounds with goblin medical compounds that smelled like copper and something herbal and worked considerably faster than their wizarding equivalents. The shoulder was back in its socket. The ribs were bound with a charm that would hold for 72 hours while the bone knit. The burns on his face had been treated with a salve that would leave, she was honest about this, some marking. Probably a faint scar along the jawline. She couldn't guarantee otherwise given the nature of the original magical source. The forehead wound she had not touched beyond the initial dressing, per Ragnar's instruction. It sat under a clean bandage and pulsed occasionally with that wrong, discordant magic, and everyone who walked past it felt their skin prickle slightly, and nobody commented on this because there was nothing useful to say. Harry Potter slept. He slept with his bandaged hand curled under his chin and his uninjured cheek pressed into the pillow, and the expression on his face was the expression of a person who had, on some fundamental level, decided that the immediate crisis was over and rest was now appropriate. Not peaceful, exactly, not the vacant slack sleep of a child without worries, but purposeful. Like he was sleeping at something rather than simply being asleep. Sharpclaw was stationed outside the door. He had volunteered for this, which was unusual enough that Iron Teeth had given him a long look, and he had met it with the stoic neutrality of a goblin who wasn't going to explain himself and didn't have to. At 3 in the morning, he heard a sound from inside the room. Not a cry. Not a distress sound. More like a small frustrated noise, followed by a determined silence, followed by the creak of the cot. He opened the door a crack and looked in. The child had pulled himself upright in the cot, which should not have been physically possible given his injuries and the general principle that babies could not reliably control their own limbs at this age, but he had done it anyway, and he was sitting with his back against the cot rail and his eyes open, staring at the far wall with the focused intensity of someone working something out. On the examination table across the room, where Ragnar had left the blood inheritance scan parchment, the silver script was glowing softly in the dark. The child was staring at it. Sharpclaw watched. After a moment, Harry Potter turned his head and looked directly at the doorway. At Sharpclaw. Those green eyes, impossible colored, exhausted, and somehow, at 15 months old in the middle of the night in a goblin bank after surviving something that should have killed him, those eyes were steady. Sharpclaw pushed the door open fully and walked in. He crossed to the cot, sat on the healer's stool, the same one Ragnar had used earlier, and looked at the child from a distance of about 2 feet. They regarded each other for a moment. "You should sleep," Sharpclaw said. Harry Potter reached out and wrapped one small hand around Sharpclaw's finger. The old guard looked down at that hand. He had been in the Goblin rebellions of 1752. He had worked a night gate for 47 years. He was not a sentimental creature. He sat very still for a moment. Then he turned his hand over so the child could hold on more comfortably, and he stayed where he was. Outside, Diagon Alley was quiet. The celebrations had finally died down. The rain had softened to a drizzle. Somewhere across the city, in the offices of the Daily Prophet, someone was setting the type for the morning edition, the headline already written, "HEWHO must not be named defeated, the Dark Lord is gone." Nobody had thought to ask yet how. Nobody had thought to wonder yet about the boy who had done it. Nobody knew yet that the boy was here, in Gringotts, safe, or as safe as a child with a magically active killing curse scar and 4 contested hereditary titles and a fraudulent Muggle guardianship could be, or that by morning, Ragnar would have paperwork that could bring the chief warlock of the Wisengamot to his knees. But the goblins knew. And goblins, as any wizard who'd ever tried to cheat one could tell you, did not lose track of things that belonged to them. At 5:58 in the morning, 2 minutes before Gringotts opened for business, Ragnar stood at the top of the marble steps inside the main entrance and watched the tellers take their positions. He watched the chandeliers flicker to their full brightness. He watched the great internal mechanisms of the bank come to life, the way they did every morning, the way they had for 9 centuries, reliable and precise and entirely indifferent to the dramas of the world outside. He had the Wardwright document in his left hand, 47 pages, including precedent, historical case law, and a very pointed section on the fraudulent invocation of ministry emergency provisions. He had the blood inheritance scan in his right. He had the Potter will, properly activated, in his breast pocket. He had read every word of everything 3 times. He was ready. The question was not whether Dumbledore would come. He would come. A man who had moved with that speed and certainty to place Harry Potter in Muggle Surrey before anyone could object was not a man who would shrug and accept the news that the child had ended up somewhere unexpected. He would come, and he would bring arguments, and he would bring authority, and he would bring the particular confidence of a man who believed, genuinely and completely, that he was the right person to make these decisions. Ragnarok looked forward to the conversation. The great bronze doors of Gringotts swung open for the day at precisely 6 o'clock, and the cold November morning came in along with the first gust of damp November air, and Diagon Alley began its cautious, celebratory, shell-shocked first morning of a post-Voldemort world. In the medical wing, 3 levels away and 200 feet underground, Harry Potter was eating porridge, goblin-made, dense and slightly odd-tasting by human standards, but warm, with the focused concentration of a child who had decided that this, too, was a priority worth addressing with his full attention. He still hadn't cried. Sharpclaw was watching from the doorway, still on the door that was technically not his shift anymore, with the expression of a goblin who had no idea what had happened to him in the last 4 hours and wasn't prepared to examine it too closely. The morning light was coming in, thin and gray in November, and it hit the silver basin on the examination table and scattered across the ceiling in small bright fragments, and Harry Potter looked up at them, those reflections of light, and for the first time since arriving at the doors of Gringotts, bloody and burned and refusing to stop moving, he made a sound. Not a cry. Not a word. Just a small, wondering noise, like someone discovering that the world, despite everything, still contained things worth looking at. Sharpclaw made a sound that was definitely not a laugh. He turned away to look at the corridor wall. His shoulders were definitely not shaking. Outside, the wizarding world was waking up to a new era, still dizzy with relief, already beginning to build the mythology of the night before, the Dark Lord vanquished, the boy who lived, the future secured. None of them knew where the boy was. None of them knew what had been found when the blood hit silver and the old words were spoken. None of them knew that in a 900-year-old bank built by a people who understood, better than anyone, that debts had to be paid and contracts had to be honored and the truth, once written down, could not be unmade. None of them knew that a war of an entirely different kind had already begun. It had begun at midnight, when a child crawled through the rain on broken hands and grabbed the hem of a goblin's jacket. And Ragnarok, standing at the top of his stairs with 47 pages of legal dynamite in his hands, was very much looking forward to what came next. Chapter 2, What the Contract Says. Albus Dumbledore arrived at Gringotts at 9:30 in the morning. He came alone, which said something about his confidence. He wore his traveling robes, deep burgundy, understated by his standards, and he carried his wand in his sleeve the way he always did, more habit than threat, the way a man carries an umbrella in uncertain weather. His half-moon spectacles caught the grey November light as he climbed the marble steps, and his expression was the expression he wore to difficult meetings, open, warm, faintly sorrowful, the face of a man who understood that hard things sometimes needed doing and had made his peace with being the one to do them. He had found out at 7 in the morning. One of his ministry contacts, a minor functionary in the Department of Magical Family Law who owed Dumbledore 3 favors and a great deal of money, had sent a Patronus that woke him from the first real sleep he'd had in 48 hours. The message had been simple: the Potter child. Gringotts has him. Ward right invoked. You'll want to move fast. He had not panicked. Albus Dumbledore did not panic. He had dressed, considered the situation from several angles over a cup of tea, and concluded that this was manageable. The goblins were protective of their legal prerogatives, but they were also fundamentally practical. They could be reasoned with. The ward right provision was ancient and almost never invoked, and when it had always been resolved through negotiation. He would explain the necessity of what he'd done. He would appeal to the long view: the war was over, the child needed protection, the blood wards at Privet Drive were the safest option available. He would be reasonable, and calm, and he would bring Harry home by noon. The goblin at the entrance desk looked up when he came through the doors. Young goblin, junior teller, the kind that usually directed visitors to their account managers with the warm efficiency of a very well-designed machine. Albus Dumbledore, Dumbledore said pleasantly. I believe your chief vault master is expecting me. Master Ragnarok's office is on the 4th level, the teller said. I'll have someone escort you. Wonderful. He smiled his best smile. The one that made people feel, instinctively, that everything was going to be all right. The teller's expression didn't change at all. The escort was a goblin named Griphook, who was young by goblin standards, barely 60, which put him somewhere in the professional equivalent of his late 20s, and who walked 3 steps ahead of Dumbledore through Gringotts' interior corridors without looking back and without speaking. His uniform was immaculate. His face gave away nothing. He moved with the specific efficiency of someone who had been told exactly why this wizard was here and had formed an opinion he wasn't being paid to share. Dumbledore followed him through corridors he hadn't walked before. The public face of Gringotts, the main hall, the teller windows, the grand staircase, was one thing. The working interior was something else entirely. Narrower. More functional. The walls were old stone fitted together without mortar, the way the first sections of Gringotts had been built, before wizard architects got involved and started adding marble. Lamps that burned without fire. Doors that had no visible handles. The hum of very old, very serious magic in the walls. They went down 2 levels, then sideways through a corridor that Dumbledore suspected moved when you weren't paying attention to it, and then up a short stair to a heavy door of goblin iron banded in bronze. Griphook knocked twice. Enter, said a voice from inside. Griphook opened the door and stepped to one side. Dumbledore walked in. The office was not what he'd expected. He had expected the theatrical weight of accumulated power, grand desk, artifacts of significance, the visual language of authority. What he got was a working room. Bookshelves so full the books were stacked sideways on top of the upright ones. A desk buried under ledgers and parchment organized in a system that was clearly meaningful but not immediately legible. 3 lamps positioned for reading rather than impression. A stone floor with a worn track where someone paced regularly between the desk and the window. Ragnarok was standing at that window when Dumbledore came in. He turned, looked at Dumbledore for a moment without speaking, and then crossed to his desk and sat down. He did not offer Dumbledore a seat. Dumbledore sat anyway. There was a chair clearly placed for visitors, and arranged himself in it with the comfortable ease of a man who owned every room he entered. Master Ragnarok. Thank you for seeing me. I have been expecting you since 7 this morning, Ragnarok said. You took longer than I anticipated. I wanted to make sure I understood the situation fully before. You understand the situation, Ragnarok said. You understand it well enough that you filed your ministry contract at 11:47 yesterday evening, less than 4 hours after the events at Godric's Hollow. That is not the timeline of a man who needed time to think. That is the timeline of a man who had a plan prepared in advance. The warmth in Dumbledore's expression dimmed, just slightly. Just enough to show that Ragnarok had struck something real. I acted quickly because the situation demanded that someone contact Sirius Black, Ragnarok said. The named guardian. Whose name is first on the will that your people filed with this bank 18 months ago and which you did not, I notice, mention to the ministry when you invoked emergency chief warlock provisions. Silence. Sirius Black, Dumbledore said carefully, is not in a position. Is he dead? No, but, is he incapacitated? Permanently and verifiably incapacitated, as required by the emergency provision you invoked? The circumstances are complicated, Master Dumbledore. Ragnarok's voice didn't go sharp. It didn't need to. It simply went very, very level, like a blade laid flat. The emergency provision you invoked to justify filing that contract requires that all named guardians be dead or permanently incapacitated. Those are the words. Not complicated. Not circumstances. Dead or permanently incapacitated. Sirius Black is neither. I have his vault records. His account has had 2 transactions in the last calendar month. That is not the account of a dead man. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, some of the warmth was gone from his voice, replaced by something more careful. More real. Sirius Black is a suspect in the deaths of James and Lily Potter. He is likely to be in ministry custody by the end of the day. Whatever his account status shows, he is a suspect, Ragnarok said. Not convicted. Not charged, as of this morning. And even if he were convicted, which would require a trial, which requires time, his status as guardian would not be voided by criminal conviction under current wizarding law without a separate family court proceeding. Which has not occurred. He picked up a document from his desk. The ministry contract you filed is invalid. It was invalid when you filed it. It is doubly invalid now that the child arrived at our doors before he could be transported to Privet Drive, which means the contract was never enacted, which means the Dursley woman's guardianship claim, such as it was, has no legal standing whatsoever. Dumbledore looked at the document. Then he looked at Ragnarok. And Wardwright? Wardwright, Ragnarok said, was invoked at 2:37 in the morning by my authority as Chief Vault Master, in accordance with Section 9 of the Gringotts Internal Charter, which predates the Ministry of Magic by 412 years. The child was unidentified, unaccompanied, injured, and presented himself at our doors with no active guardian bond and no legal guardian in physical attendance. Those are the conditions. The invocation was lawful. He set the document down. Hadrian James Potter is a ward of Gringotts. Dumbledore was quiet for a longer moment this time. He took off his spectacles, polished them with the end of his sleeve, a habit, something he did when he was recalibrating, and put them back on. I would like to see the child. That will depend on what this conversation produces, Ragnarok said. He needs to be somewhere safe. The threat isn't over, we don't know the full extent of what occurred last night, we don't know whether there are remaining Death Eaters who would target him, the blood wards I have planned at Privet Drive are specifically designed to, the child is in Gringotts, Ragnarok said. He is considerably safer here than in a Muggle suburb. The magic of a mother's sacrifice is not a ward that Gringotts requires you to explain to us. Ragnarok's tone didn't change. We are aware of sacrifice magic. We are aware of blood protection. We are also aware that blood wards of that nature are extraordinarily powerful and would function from any blood relative's home, not exclusively the home you chose. The sister in Surrey was not the only option. She was the most convenient option. Convenient, specifically, because she is a Muggle with no connection to the wizarding world and no framework for understanding the legal rights of the child in her care. Dumbledore said nothing. Which brings me, Ragnarok said, and he picked up a second document, this one with a red border around its edges, to the secondary clause in the contract you filed. The silence in the room changed texture. Dumbledore looked at the document. His expression was, for the first time, completely unreadable. Not the warm opacity of a man managing a difficult meeting. Simply, blank. Where did you get that? The blood inheritance scan, Ragnarok said. When we scan an unidentified minor for inheritance purposes, we scan for all active contracts tied to the bloodline. Your contract was tied to the bloodline. It came up. That clause is a ministry internal document, it is attached to a contract that was filed using emergency chief warlock powers, Ragnarok said. Everything attached to that contract is subject to our review under the terms of the Gringotts Ministry Information Sharing Accord of 1823. Which you signed. In your capacity as Supreme Mugwump. He paused. You are a thorough man, Master Dumbledore. I wonder sometimes if thoroughness becomes a habit so deep that a man stops checking what he's already agreed to. Dumbledore looked at the document for a long moment. Something moved across his face, not guilt, not quite, but the expression of a man being forced to look at something from an angle he hadn't chosen. The payment to the Dursley woman was to ensure the child would be properly cared for. I am not unaware of what I was asking of them. A magical child, an extraordinary one, in a Muggle household, they needed resources. 200 galleons from the child's own vault, Ragnarok said. Plus 100 galleons per year. You took the money from the child to pay the people you assigned to house him. The Potter estate is substantial. The child will never, it is his money, Ragnarok said. He did not consent to it being used to fund his own placement. His parents did not authorize it. No court authorized it. You took it because you had access to the Chief Warlock's emergency provisions and you assumed nobody would check the secondary clause. He set the document down next to the first one. We checked. Dumbledore leaned forward slightly. His voice, when it came, was quieter, and there was something in it that wasn't the warmth or the authority but something underneath both, the voice of a man who genuinely meant what he was saying, which somehow made it more difficult to argue with. I have seen what this boy will face. I have seen, in ways I cannot fully explain, what he is meant for. The path ahead of him is not a kind one. I have tried to give him something the magical world cannot give him, an ordinary childhood. A life before the weight of destiny. A chance to be a boy before he has to be a legend. I know how this looks. I know the contract is irregular. But everything I have done has been to protect him. Ragnarok looked at him for a long moment. You protected him, Ragnarok said, by sending a 15-month-old child to strangers in Surrey. And the child arrived at our doors last night, crawling, Master Dumbledore. Crawling on the cobblestones of Diagon Alley in the rain. Alone. With burns on his face and a dislocated shoulder and no identification and no guardian bond and a wound on his forehead that is still magically active this morning. He held Dumbledore's gaze. Your protection sent that child to us by way of a very long crawl on broken hands. I will let you evaluate how effective it was. The room was quiet for a very long time. I want to see him, Dumbledore said again. Quieter now. No. He is a child, he is our ward, Ragnarok said. And until the legal questions are resolved, which will not be this morning, and possibly not this week, you have no standing to request access to him. You had standing. You filed a contract that removed your standing and was subsequently invalidated. You are currently, Master Dumbledore, a private citizen in a bank lobby. Dumbledore sat back. He looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked up, and his eyes, behind those half-moon spectacles, were very old and very sharp and not at all defeated. This isn't over. No, Ragnarok agreed. It is not. I expect your solicitors within the week. I suggest they bring considerable patience and a familiarity with pre-ministry contract law. He picked up his pen and turned back to his desk, which was the goblin equivalent of a very clear dismissal. Griphook will show you out. Dumbledore stood. He was silent for a moment, and then he said, very quietly, is he all right? Ragnarok did not look up from his ledger. He is eating breakfast. Something shifted in Dumbledore's expression, something complicated and genuine that he didn't quite manage to keep off his face. Then he nodded once, to himself more than to anyone, and followed Griphook out. Griphook had been assigned to the Dumbledore escort as a deliberate choice on Ragnarok's part, and Griphook understood why. He was young, he was sharp, and he was extremely good at moving through Gringotts in ways that meant a visitor only ever saw what he was supposed to see. The route back to the main hall was slightly different from the route down. Not dramatically different. Just enough that it passed within 30 feet of the medical wing corridor without going anywhere near it. Standard practice when the bank was hosting a sensitive guest. Dumbledore noticed anyway. He didn't say anything, but Griphook caught the slight cant of his head, the infinitesimal pause in his step, the way his eyes moved toward the closed door at the end of the medical corridor as they passed the junction. He felt something from the direction of that door. Griphook could see it on his face, not the awareness you'd expect from proximity to a person, but the awareness of a man who had some kind of compass trained on what was behind it. A tracking spell, maybe. Or something older and less technical. The old man had clearly known where the child was before he'd been told anything. Griphook filed that away. When they reached the main entrance, Dumbledore paused on the steps and looked back, just once. "You were assigned to the Harry Potter account?" he asked. Griphook looked at him. "I am a general floor teller, sir." "Of course." Dumbledore's mouth curved slightly. "Good morning." He walked down the steps and away into Diagon Alley, unhurried, already thinking, and Griphook watched him go and then turned and went directly back to Ragnarok's office. He knew where the child was, Griphook said, before Ragnarok could speak. "Before you told him anything. He has some kind of locate on the boy." Ragnarok nodded once. "I know. I've already had it looked at. There's a trace embedded in the scar, not part of the curse remnant, a separate working. Old magic. The kind that tells you the general location of the subject." He looked at Griphook. "It has been noted and is being addressed. Can we remove it?" "Not safely. Not yet. The scar is still too active." He was quiet for a moment. "What we can do is establish enough magical interference around the child's location that the trace reads Gringotts without providing anything more specific. He'll know where Harry is. He won't know more than that, and he can't use it to make a legal claim." He looked at Griphook. "I'm giving you an assignment." Griphook straightened slightly. He was 63 years old and had been at Gringotts for 40 years, and he had been waiting, with the patience of someone who understood that the best assignments came to those who didn't ask for them, for something more interesting than floor accounts. "The Harry Potter account," Ragnarok said. "Vault 687. You will be his primary account manager. This means you handle all correspondence relating to his accounts, all inheritance filings, all external inquiries about his status from ministry or private sources, and you report directly to me." He paused. "It also means you will be his primary contact within Gringotts as he grows older. The child needs a consistent point of contact. Someone who understands both the legal landscape and how to explain it to someone who will, for some years, be too young to understand most of it." Griphook looked at him. "You want me to, mind a human infant?" "I want you to build a relationship with a child who will one day be the heir to 4 of the most powerful bloodlines in the wizarding world," Ragnarok said. "And who currently has nobody in his life who isn't either dead, in ministry custody, or trying to manipulate him. He will need an ally he can trust." He looked at Griphook steadily. "That is not a small thing I am asking you to do." Griphook was quiet for a moment. "You think he'll stay here long enough for any of that to matter?" "I think," Ragnarok said, "that we will be fighting in courts and before the Wisengamot for the next several years, and that by the time it's resolved, the child will have grown up considerably. And I think that when it is resolved, what he has learned in this place and who he has learned it from will matter a great deal." He looked back at his desk. "Go meet your account holder, Griphook. He is in the medical wing. He is awake and I am told he is deeply interested in the contents of a copper lamp on the ceiling." Harry Potter was, in fact, intensely interested in the lamp. It was one of the goblin-made varieties that burned without a wick or fuel, a soft steady amber light that didn't flicker. He had been staring at it for several minutes with the focused, slightly cross-eyed attention of a baby who had recently discovered that the world contained more than one interesting thing and was making a thorough catalogue. He was sitting up in his cot. He was not supposed to be sitting up. Iron Teeth had made extensive notes about the importance of keeping his weight off his injured side, but the binding charm was doing most of the structural work, and Harry Potter had opinions about lying down that were apparently not going to be overridden by medical instruction. He was small. Griphook had known, intellectually, that he would be small, 15 months old. That was just a fact about human development, but there was something about the reality of it, Standing in the doorway and looking at this tiny person who had crawled through Diagon Alley in the rain and grabbed Sharpclaw's jacket and survived a killing curse and was currently sitting upright despite medical advice and a dislocated shoulder that had been reset 6 hours ago, that made Griphook pause. Harry noticed him immediately. Turned his head away from the lamp and looked at Griphook with those green eyes, and Griphook had the uncomfortable experience of feeling assessed by someone who could not yet use complete sentences. "Your name is Hadrian James Potter," Griphook said, because he was a goblin and he didn't believe in easing into things. "You have 4 hereditary titles, approximately 90,000 galleons in a trust vault, and a considerable amount of legal trouble attached to your name. I am Griphook. I will be managing your accounts." Harry watched him. "You don't understand any of that," Griphook said. Harry made a sound that was not quite a word. "Right." Griphook crossed the room, pulled the healer's stool to within a few feet of the cot, and sat down. He didn't reach out. He didn't try the things he'd observed humans doing with infants, the cooing, the reaching, the faces. He just sat at a reasonable distance and looked at the child. Harry looked back at him. After a moment, with the gravity of someone making a significant decision, Harry leaned forward and grabbed the edge of Griphook's sleeve. "You are very grabby for someone with a healing shoulder," Griphook said. Harry did not let go. He looked down at the sleeve fabric with the expression of someone conducting research. "Fine," Griphook said. He sat there for a while, which is how Iron Teeth found them when she came in for the midday assessment, the account manager and the infant, sitting in companionable silence, Harry holding Griphook's sleeve and Griphook holding perfectly still with the expression of a goblin who had just realized something had happened to him and was not sure what to do about it. By midday, 3 things had happened simultaneously in the wider world. Sirius Black had been arrested. Not tried, there hadn't been time for that, arrested, because Bartemius Crouch Sr. had decided that emergency wartime protocols were still in effect and that processing could happen after containment. A report had gone to the ministry at 9 in the morning, Crouch had signed the order by 10, and by 11 Sirius Black was in a ministry holding cell without a wand and without anyone having asked him a single question about what had actually happened in Godric's Hollow. Ragnarok received this information at 12:15 through a contact in the Ministry Department of Records, and he sat with it for exactly long enough to let the implications settle properly. The named guardian was in custody. Without a trial. Without a hearing. Without any formal adjudication of the guardianship claim. If Black was held indefinitely without trial, and Crouch was the kind of man who could make indefinite look administrative, then Dumbledore's original argument about the emergency provision would gain a certain retrospective plausibility. Not legal validity. But plausibility, in the court of public opinion, was sometimes more useful than legal validity. He sent 2 messages. The first was to the Gringotts legal team: begin monitoring the Black case. Any formal proceedings, any charging documents, any sentencing, he wanted to know within the hour. The second was to the Black family vault manager: pull everything. Account status, open contracts, the blood adoption filing, all of it. He wanted the complete picture of Sirius Black's legal standing before Dumbledore's solicitors started arguing that Black couldn't be guardian because Black was in Azkaban. The second thing was that the Daily Prophet had run its morning edition. The headline was enormous. The Boy Who Lived. The story was breathless and inaccurate in several specific ways, but the details that mattered were correct enough. Harry Potter, infant son of James and Lily Potter, had somehow survived the killing curse. He who must not be named had been destroyed. The Dark War was over. The name Harry Potter was now a household word. By the afternoon edition, there was already a follow-up story: Where is the Boy Who Lived? The reporter, one Rita Skeeter, whose byline Ragnarok recognized from previous coverage that had been notable for its enthusiasm and its flexibility with fact, had apparently been unable to locate the child at Godric's Hollow, or at any of the Potter's associated residences, or in the care of any named acquaintance. Ragnarok read this story with the careful attention of someone identifying a future problem. The third thing was a letter. It arrived by owl, a very elegant owl, black-feathered, clearly expensive, and it was addressed to the Chief Vault Master of Gringotts Bank, London, in a handwriting that was precise and slightly cold and very controlled. Ragnok opened it. Dear Master Ragnok, I have heard, through channels I will not specify, that Gringotts Bank has recently acquired a ward who may be a relation of mine. As the senior living member of the House of Black, I have a hereditary interest in the welfare of any child bearing black blood, and I would appreciate the opportunity to discuss this matter at your earliest convenience. I am also aware that certain legal proceedings may be underway regarding this child's guardianship status. I have some experience with family law, and I have information that may be relevant to the disposition of those proceedings. I hope we may speak soon. Narcissa Malfoy, née Black. Ragnok read the letter twice. Then he set it down on his desk and looked at it for a moment. Narcissa Malfoy, wife of Lucius Malfoy, who was the kind of Death Eater who had very expensive lawyers and had been loudly claiming Imperius at every dinner party since approximately midnight. Sister of Bellatrix Lestrange, who was not claiming anything because Bellatrix Lestrange had never cared what people thought. And sister of Sirius Black, the man now sitting in a ministry-holding cell. She was also, under Black family law, the second-ranking living Black. If Sirius was incapacitated, and a ministry-holding cell, however illegitimate, was a form of incapacitation, then Narcissa had a secondary claim to oversight of the Black family interests. Including, technically, the interests of anyone bearing black blood by adoption. She was reaching out within hours of the news breaking, before Dumbledore's solicitors had even drafted their first letter. That was not the move of a woman who had been waiting to see which way the wind blew. That was the move of a woman who had been watching the board and had decided, with considerable precision, where to place her piece. Ragnok picked up his pen and began drafting a reply. Harry Potter's afternoon was considerably less political than the morning had been. Iron Teeth had, with some reservations, cleared him to be moved from the examination table to a small side room that was slightly less clinical. One of the junior staff had produced, from somewhere that nobody entirely explained, a collection of small objects clearly intended to occupy a baby, a wooden ball carved with goblin geometric patterns, a toy that made a noise when squeezed which turned out to be more alarming than intended, a small bronze mirror. Harry had ignored the ball, been deeply suspicious of the noise toy, and spent a considerable amount of time looking at himself in the mirror with the expression of someone trying to resolve a question. The scar was visible in the mirror. The bandage was small, covering most of it, but the shape pressed through slightly and the skin around it was still faintly pink from magical heat. He didn't seem frightened of it. He touched the bandage once, lightly, and then went back to looking at the rest of his face, his eyes, specifically. He seemed, in the way of young children who have not yet learned that mirrors are ordinary objects, slightly surprised that there was someone else in there. Griphook was sitting in the corner with a ledger he was pretending to read. He wasn't reading it. He was watching the child and thinking about what Ragnok had said about building trust, and about the fact that this small person would one day have access to resources and titles and political standing that most wizarding adults only dreamed of, and that how he was shaped in the years between now and then would determine what kind of force he became in the world. Goblins had a saying, "The blade is made in the forge, not the battle." What happened here, in these early years, would be the forge. "You're going to be a problem for a lot of people," Griphook said to him conversationally. "You already are. There are probably 6 or 7 solicitors having meetings about you right now. The chief warlock is reconsidering his choices. At least one Malfoy has written us a letter." Harry had turned from the mirror and was looking at him again. "The thing about being a problem," Griphook said, "is that problems are only problems for people who can't solve them. The people who can solve them call them something else." He paused. "Opportunities. Leverage. Depending on the kind of goblin you are." He wasn't sure why he was talking to a 15-month-old as though the child was going to reply with something useful. He was pretty sure Harry understood about 4 words he'd said. But those green eyes were listening with a quality that made Griphook feel, with an irrational and inexplicable certainty, that somewhere behind the infancy and the healing injuries and the incomprehensible vocabulary deficit, there was a mind that was paying close attention to everything. He closed his ledger. "You'll like the vaults," he said. "When you're old enough. Deep magic down there. Old things. The kind of things that remember." Harry made a sound. It wasn't a word, but it had the inflection of a question. Griphook looked at him. "Yes," he said, as if answering it. "We'll go together." At 4 o'clock, Ragnarok convened a second meeting. This one was smaller, just Goldtooth, Slate-Hand, and the head of the legal division, an iron-faced goblin named Copperthorn who had been litigating wizarding contract disputes for longer than Dumbledore had been alive and who had a reputation for finding the single load-bearing clause in any legal structure and removing it with the precision of a controlled demolition. "We have 3 active fronts," Ragnarok said. "First, the Dumbledore contract challenge. Copperthorn, how do we stand?" "The contract is void," Copperthorn said. "I could demonstrate this to any impartial court in 6 minutes. The problem is impartiality. The Wisengamot's family division is chaired by a Dumbledore appointment. The Ministry's family law office used Dumbledore's emergency provision to process the original filing. We will not get an unbiased hearing in any Ministry venue in the short term." "Then we don't use Ministry venues," Ragnarok said. "The International Court of Magical Agreements," Copperthorn said. "We have standing there by virtue of the 1823 Accord. Dumbledore's signature on that document actually becomes a liability for him. It subjects him to the court's jurisdiction in any matter where a Gringotts filing is involved. I can have a case filed by the end of the week." "Do it." Second front, Sirius Black. He was arrested without a warrant, without formal charges being filed under standard procedure, and under emergency wartime provisions that technically expired at the end of active hostilities. Copperthorn's tone conveyed the precise amount of contempt this deserved. "If you know who is gone, and the Ministry has already publicly stated he is, then wartime emergency provisions have no standing. We have grounds to challenge the legality of the arrest itself. Who do we engage for Black's legal representation?" "He doesn't have a lawyer," Slate-Hand said. "He hasn't been given access to one. He doesn't know to ask for one." Ragnarok looked at Copperthorn. "I will arrange for a legal notice to be delivered to the minister's office," Copperthorn said. "Citing the charter right of any ward of Gringotts to have their named guardians afforded legal due process, since the guardianship determination cannot be made while that guardian's status is legally ambiguous. It will not get Black out today. But it will force the Ministry to either charge him formally, which requires evidence, which requires a trial, which requires time, or release him." He paused. "Given what Crouch will have to produce in terms of actual evidence, I suspect formal charging would be uncomfortable for them." Third front, Ragnarok said. "The scar." Goldtooth, who had been silent, leaned forward slightly. "The Cursebreaker's report came in an hour ago." She slid it across the table. Ragnarok picked it up. He read it. His expression, already carefully neutral, became more so, the specific neutrality of someone processing information that required very precise handling. "There is something in the scar," he said. "Not just residual magic. Something aware." "The Cursebreakers believe so," Goldtooth said. "Low level. Dormant. It's not active in the sense of directing the child's behavior or communicating with him. But there is a fragment of something embedded in the wound that does not belong to the child's own magic. It has its own signature. It is," she paused, "the same signature as the creature who cast the killing curse." The room was quiet. "He put a piece of himself in the child," Ragnarok said. It wasn't a question. "Unintentionally," Goldtooth said. "The Cursebreaker's theory is that the killing curse rebounded, and in rebounding, tore something loose from the caster, and that something latched onto the nearest living magical host, which was the child. It's not a possession. It's not a fragment with sufficient coherence to direct thought. But it is a remnant. Can it be removed? Not safely. Not yet. The child's magic is too young and too entangled with it. The cursebreakers say in 5 years, possibly 7, they may be able to extract it without risk to him. Goldtooth's voice was as flat and steady as always, but her eyes were sharp. In the meantime, the child carries it. And it would explain, at least in part, why someone like Dumbledore was so committed to isolating him. If the remnant were to develop, to grow, to become something more, he would want the child far from the wizarding world when it did. He knew, Ragnarok said. He suspected, Goldtooth said. Probably. I doubt he fully understood what had embedded itself. But he knew enough to want the child contained. Ragnarok looked at the report for a long moment. This child, he said, slowly and precisely, survived a killing curse at 15 months old. He carries 4 hereditary bloodlines of extraordinary power. He has a fragment of the most dangerous dark wizard in living memory embedded in a wound on his forehead. And the most powerful light wizard in living memory tried to hide him in Muggle Surrey before anyone noticed any of this. He set the report down. The question is not whether this will become the defining story of the next generation. It will. The question is what the story says when it is told. He looked around the table. We have this child. He is ours to protect under every applicable law, and we will use every applicable law. But what he becomes, that is not something we can control. It is something we can shape. He stood up. Make sure the forge is good, he said, almost to himself. Then, louder, get me the Narcissa Malfoy meeting arranged for tomorrow. Get Copperthorn's case filed by Friday. And someone make sure the child has something better than that noise toy. It was clearly distressing to everyone involved. Copperthorn looked briefly mystified by this last instruction but wrote it down. That night, Gringotts was quiet again. The bank had closed at 5 and the long corridors had gone still, and somewhere in the deep working heart of the place the count of the day's transactions was being done with the meticulous finality that goblins brought to numbers, and the great records were being updated, and in a small side room on the 4th level of the medical wing, Harry Potter was asleep. Actually asleep this time. The thorough, complete sleep of a child whose body was doing the serious work of healing, his breathing slow and even, both hands curled near his face. Griphook sat in the chair in the corner for a while after he was sure Harry was asleep. Not because there was a reason to. He'd done the ledger work he'd been using as cover for the last several hours. He'd filed the preliminary account management forms. He'd read the inheritance scan twice and had a fairly clear picture of the legal landscape ahead. He sat there because the room was quiet and the child was sleeping, and it occurred to him, in the specific way that things occurred to goblins, as a calculation, as an assessment of value, that he had, today, become responsible for something. Not just the accounts. Not just the legal filings and the inheritance documentation and the formal correspondence. He'd become responsible for this. For this small person in the cot who had crawled across cobblestones and grabbed the first hand available and held on, and who had looked at him this afternoon with eyes that were paying attention to everything, and who was going to grow up in this place surrounded by goblins and ancient magic and contracts and vaults, and who was going to need, more than legal expertise, someone who would be honest with him. Goblins were good at honest. Goblins were very good at honest, in a way that wizards often found uncomfortable. Good, Griphook thought. The boy would need to be comfortable with uncomfortable truths. He was going to encounter a great many of them. He stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked to the door. He paused there and looked back. Harry Potter, asleep, looked like any other human infant. Small and dark-haired and breathing steadily and completely unaware of the legal machinery currently being assembled in his name, of the man who had tried to ship him to Surrey, of the fragment of dark magic sitting in his scar, of the 4 bloodlines worth of history and obligation waiting for him to grow into them. He just looked like a baby. But Griphook had been watching him all day, and he had seen what was underneath. Get some rest, he said quietly. "You're going to be very busy in about 10 years." He turned off the lamp and went back to work. Chapter 3, 10 years in gold. The first time Harry made something explode, he was 3 years old and deeply unhappy about a bowl of porridge. It wasn't the porridge itself. He'd been eating goblin porridge since he could hold a spoon, and he'd long since made his peace with the fact that it tasted like copper and oats and something ancient. It was the temperature. Iron Teeth had put it in front of him still steaming, and Harry had reached for it immediately, and the heat had surprised him, and the resulting burst of accidental magic had sent the bowl into the wall with enough force to leave a dent in the stone. The porridge had gone everywhere. Iron Teeth had looked at the ceiling for a moment, then at Harry, then at the porridge dripping down her best medical cabinet. "Next time," she said, without visible emotion, "blow on it first." Harry had looked at the dent in the wall, then back at her, with the expression of someone making a note. After that, his accidental magic had a pattern to it. Not random emotional outbursts, he wasn't that kind of child. His magic responded to frustration, specifically the frustration of wanting to do something and being physically incapable of it yet. A book on a high shelf that he couldn't reach came down on its own. A door that was too heavy for his 3-year-old hands swung open before he touched it. Once, memorably, when Sharpclaw was trying to teach him a simple goblin counting game and Harry couldn't make the bronze tokens do what he wanted, all 6 tokens had risen off the table simultaneously and hung in the air in a perfect formation until Harry laughed, startled by his own success, and dropped them. Sharpclaw had picked up the tokens one by one and put them back on the table. "Again," he'd said. Harry grew up in Gringotts the way rivers grow, finding their path through the available landscape, shaping themselves around what was there, moving always forward. The bank was not designed for children, and nobody had expected to be raising one here, and the adjustments made to accommodate him were pragmatic rather than warm. A room converted from storage, a small enclosed courtyard 2 levels below the main hall where sunlight came in through a grated ceiling and Harry could run without being underfoot. A rotating cast of goblins who took on his education by subject matter expertise because none of them had any idea how humans taught their children and they were unwilling to ask. The result was an education that had very little to do with what Harry would eventually receive at Hogwarts and a great deal to do with what actually mattered. Sharpclaw taught him numbers. Not sums in the gentle schoolroom sense, but the goblin philosophy of numbers, that quantity was a form of truth, that accurate accounting was a moral act, that a discrepancy in a ledger was not an error but an indicator that pointed towards something real. Harry was doing complex multi-denomination currency conversions in his head by age 7 and had, on 2 separate occasions, found errors in junior teller accounts that the tellers themselves hadn't caught. He mentioned this without pride, as a simple fact. Sharpclaw mentioned it to Ragnarok with something that was definitely not pride either. Iron Teeth, who had transitioned from healer to something more like a general guardian of Harry's physical well-being without either of them acknowledging this transition, taught him the fundamentals of magical anatomy, his own, specifically. By age 6 Harry understood that his magic was unusually dense for his age, that it responded to intent faster than average, and that the thing in his forehead scar was not part of him and never would be, regardless of what it tried to convince him of on the days when it ached and pushed unpleasant images at the edges of his sleep. He learned to notice it, identify it, and set it aside. He was not afraid of it. He had grown up with it, which meant it had become a known thing, and known things, Gringotts had taught him, were manageable. It was the unknown you needed to watch for. Griphook taught him everything else. Law, first. Goblin contract law, wizarding inheritance law, the specific architecture of the Wisengamot's procedural rules, the difference between what was legal and what was just, and how those 2 things diverged in ways that shaped history. He taught him how to read a contract, not just the words but the structure, the omissions, where the language went vague and why. He taught him that the most dangerous clause in any agreement was the one that looked boring. Then politics. How power actually moved in the wizarding world, not through the ministry hierarchy, which was the visible surface, but through the web of family obligations, hereditary alliances, old debts, and the fact that half the Wisengamot had great-grandparents who had made deals that were still technically binding. Harry absorbed this the way he absorbed numbers, not as memorization but as pattern recognition, always asking why the structure was that way, always finding the load-bearing piece. Then history. Not the sanitized ministry-approved version, but the real history, the goblin rebellions, the actual causes of them, what the goblins had been owed and how the debt had been defaulted on, the specific mechanisms by which the wizarding world had, over centuries, built its wealth and security on the labor of creatures it refused to grant legal personhood. Harry was 9 when he asked Griphook, very directly, whether goblins resented wizards. Griphook had given him a long look. "We respect what is worthy of respect," he said. "We remember what has been done. We do not confuse the two." Harry had thought about this for a while. "That sounds like a yes." "It sounds like the truth," Griphook said. "Which is more useful?" When Harry was 4, Ragnarok took him into the vaults for the first time. Not Vault 687, his vault, the trust vault, the one with the money in it. He would see that one later. This was deeper. This was the vault corridors that went down into the real dark, where the rails curved away into the mountain and the air changed temperature every 3 levels and the magic in the walls got dense enough that you could feel it on your skin. They rode the cart together, Ragnarok, Harry, and a very senior cart driver named Boneflint who had been doing this run for 90 years and had the particular serenity of someone who had made peace with the fact that the cart was always trying to kill you and found this acceptable. Harry sat in the front of the cart with his hands on the sides and his eyes enormous and the expression on his face that became familiar over the years, not fear, not even exactly excitement, but a kind of focused, hungry attention, like the world was showing him something and he wasn't going to miss it. They went down 6 levels below the deepest standard vault. The vault there didn't belong to anyone alive. It was part of the historical record, an ancient chamber that predated the current Gringotts structure, where the bank kept artifacts of magical historical significance that had been unclaimed for more than 2 centuries. The door was goblin iron and 12 feet tall and hummed with magic so old it had developed its own personality. Ragnarok placed his palm on the door and spoke the opening words in gobbledygook, and the vault swung open. Inside, it was vast and dim, the kind of space that changed your sense of scale. High ceiling lost in shadow. Shelves and cases and pedestals bearing objects that glowed or moved or were very still in a way that communicated importance even to a 4-year-old. Harry walked in behind Ragnarok and stopped. He stood still for a moment, and then he did something that Ragnarok had not expected. He closed his eyes. He stood there with his eyes closed for a long moment while Ragnarok watched. Then he opened them. "It's all talking," he said. "All the old things. They're all saying things. Not words. Just," he struggled. His vocabulary at 4 was considerable but not sufficient. "Feelings. Old feelings." Ragnarok was quiet for a moment. "That is ancient magic you are sensing," he said. "The accumulated magical resonance of very old and very significant objects. Is that normal?" Harry asked. "For most wizards, no," Ragnarok said. "They would feel a general presence. A weight. What you are describing, specific resonances, differentiated impressions, is considerably beyond what most adult wizards would register." Harry looked around the vault. He had that concentrated expression again. "The one on the left," he said, "feels like it's angry. Old angry. Not at me. Just old angry. That is a sword belonging to the first king of an early British wizarding clan," Ragnarok said. "It was used in a massacre. The magic remembers." Harry looked at it for a moment. "The one in the middle feels like water. Cold and deep. That is a mirror. We don't know its origin. We know it shows something true and that most people find what they see in it deeply unpleasant. What do you see in it?" "I have never looked," Ragnarok said. "I find that instruments that tell you truths you did not ask for are best treated with professional respect and reasonable distance. Harry looked at the mirror for another moment. Then, with the decisive practicality of a child who had internalized an enormous amount of goblin philosophy, he looked away from it. "Good," Ragnarok said. They spent 2 hours in the vault. Ragnarok told him the history of every significant object, and Harry listened the way he always listened, completely, with the occasional question that went straight to the center of whatever was being said, and the occasional silence that communicated he was making connections Ragnarok hadn't prompted. On the ride back up, Harry sat in the front of the cart in the dark and said, "Griphook says I have 4 houses. Does that mean I have vaults for all of them?" "Yes," Ragnarok said. "When you are old enough, you will have access to all of them." "What's in them?" "History," Ragnarok said. "Knowledge. Objects of power. Your inheritance." Harry was quiet, watching the vault walls scroll past in the lamplight. "Does Dumbledore know about all of it?" Ragnarok paused. "He knows about the Potter vault. He does not have full knowledge of the Peveril or Slytherin holdings. But he knows I'll get them." "Yes. Is that why he wanted me in Surrey?" Harry asked. "So I wouldn't know?" He was 4 years old. Ragnarok looked at the back of his head, the dark hair that never quite lay flat, the small shoulders, the hands still on the cart side rail, and recalibrated, for the first time but not the last, the rate at which he needed to have certain conversations. "Partly," he said. "There are other reasons too. We can talk about all of them." "Okay," Harry said. He watched the walls. "Just not tonight. I want to think about the vault first." "Of course," Ragnarok said. He was 6 when he first heard the name Voldemort said without a flinch. Griphook said it, matter-of-factly, in the middle of a historical summary of the First Wizarding War and its economic effects on the magical British economy. Not you-know-who, not he who must not be named, just Voldemort, the same way you'd say any name, a proper noun, a label for a specific historical actor. Harry had repeated it quietly to himself afterward, feeling the way it sat in his mouth. Then he asked Griphook why wizards were afraid of a name. "Because Voldemort made them afraid of it," Griphook said. "It was deliberate. If you can make people flinch at a word, you have put a fragment of your power inside every person who can't say it. It is, from a strategic perspective, quite elegant." "So saying it is taking that power back," Harry said. "Saying it is simply accurate," Griphook said. "The taking back aspect is a secondary benefit." Harry had filed this away with the focused practicality that made Griphook, increasingly, slightly unsettled in a way he wasn't going to examine too closely. The outside world tried to reach Harry 4 times in his first 5 years. The first was Dumbledore, through solicitors as predicted, arguing in the International Court of Magical Agreements that Wardright was being improperly applied. Copperthorne demolished this argument over the course of 8 months with the thoroughness of someone who had been preparing for it since November 1981. The court ruled in Gringotts' favor. Wardright stood. Dumbledore's solicitors filed an appeal. Copperthorne was already waiting for it. The second was a ministry representative named Doris Hedgewick from the Department of Magical Family Law, who arrived with a very official briefcase and the expression of someone who had been assured this was a simple administrative visit. Ragnarok met her in the entrance hall, handed her a copy of the International Court ruling, and explained that the ministry had no jurisdiction in the matter until such time as the court's ruling was challenged in a higher body, which would require the International Confederation of Wizards, which would require a 3/4 majority vote, which Dumbledore was unlikely to secure given that Gringotts did the banking for 11 of the 19 Confederation member states. Doris Hedgewick had left with her very official briefcase and an expression suggesting she was going to have a difficult conversation with whoever had sent her. The third was Narcissa Malfoy, who came in person. She came without fanfare and without Lucius, which said something. She wore grey robes that cost more than most wizards made in a year, and she walked into Ragnarok's office with the posture of a woman who had decided, at some point, that she was not going to be afraid of anyone and had maintained this decision ever since. She sat in the visitor's chair without waiting to be invited. You got my letter, she said. I did, Ragnok said. The Black family is owed a presence in this situation, she said. Sirius is, she paused, and something moved across her face that might have been complicated feelings about her brother, but she smoothed it away. Sirius is unavailable. I am the senior Black. I have a legal interest in the well-being of any child carrying Black blood. What do you want? Ragnok asked, because goblins believed in getting there directly. Narcissa looked at him for a moment. Then, surprisingly, she said, I want to know he's safe. And I want him to know the Blacks exist and that not all of them are what Bellatrix is. She paused. And I want a seat at the table when the legal proceedings resume, because whatever Dumbledore is planning for this child, the Black family has interests that run counter to it, and I would rather be useful to you than antagonistic. Ragnok had looked at her for a long moment. You understand that Gringotts does not take sides. I understand that Gringotts takes the side of the contract, Narcissa said. Which is currently the side of the child. I am offering to be useful to that side. The price is information access and the assurance that when Harry Potter is old enough to know about his Black heritage, he is told accurately. That was always going to happen, Ragnok said. I know, Narcissa said. I wanted to hear you say it. He had given her limited information access. Not to Harry himself, that would come later, but to the general shape of the legal proceedings, filtered through Gringotts' own interests. She had, in the years following, proved useful twice, once by providing documentation that had been relevant to the serious Black situation, and once by making sure that a particular ministry memo that would have complicated the ward-right arrangement was quietly buried before it reached the appropriate desk. She never asked for anything in return that Gringotts hadn't already been prepared to give. Griphook had told Harry about her when he was 7. He'd described her neutrally, factually, and waited for Harry's questions. Harry had asked, is she trustworthy? She is reliable, Griphook said. Those are different things. She is reliable because her interests and our interests overlap. That is not the same as trust, but it is the same as useful. Harry had thought about this. Can I meet her? When you're older. What age counts as older? When you're old enough to assess her yourself and not take my assessment for granted. Harry had given him a long look that said, clearly, that he found this answer simultaneously reasonable and inconvenient. Fine. The fourth attempt came when Harry was 5, and it was neither legal nor official. A man had come into the Leaky Cauldron end of Diagon Alley in the early morning, wearing a glamour that wasn't quite good enough if you knew what to look for. He had gone to the apothecary, and then the robe shop, and both times he'd asked the shop owners, conversationally, about the Potter boy. Had they seen him? Did they know where he was being kept? Casual questions. The shop owners had reported this to Gringotts by midday, because Gringotts paid very well for information of this type and had made this arrangement quietly with every business in Diagon Alley 2 weeks after Harry's arrival. The glamour, stripped away by the security team's analysis of the descriptions, revealed the face of a man Ragnok identified from the Black family records as Rabaston Lestrange. A Death Eater who had not been caught, who had been quietly not caught for 3 years because his brother's wife was Bellatrix and Bellatrix had people who paid attention on her behalf. Ragnok had sent a very precise tip to the Auror office. Rabaston Lestrange had been arrested by end of day. He did not tell Harry about this. Harry was 5. But he noted it in the files, because it confirmed what he already knew. There were people outside Gringotts who wanted Harry Potter, for reasons ranging from political to genuine threat, and the ward-right protections needed to be not just legal but physical. He had doubled the external ward network that week. Harry was 7 when Sirius Black escaped from Azkaban. Not escaped, was released, finally, after Copperthorne's legal challenge had spent 2 years working its way through the system and had eventually reached a court that wasn't in Dumbledore's pocket, and the lack of a trial record and the lack of formal charges and the small matter of it being illegal to imprison someone for 2 years without charging them had accumulated into a judgment that was simply impossible to argue with. Sirius Black walked out of Azkaban looking like a man who had been in Azkaban for 2 years, which was not a look anyone chose. He came to Gringotts 3 days later. He was thin and grey-faced and his eyes were the eyes of someone who had spent 24 months in close proximity to Dementors and was rebuilding himself from the foundation up. He sat in Ragnarok's office and he was told, systematically, everything that had happened from the night of November 1st onward. He didn't speak through most of it. When Ragnarok finished, he sat with his hands on his knees and looked at the middle distance for a long moment. "He's here," he said. "Harry's here." "He is," Ragnarok said. "Can I see him?" "That is his decision," Ragnarok said. "Not mine and not yours." Sirius looked at him. Something raw moved across his face. "He's 7 years old." "He is," Ragnarok said. "And he is 7 years old who has had 2 years to form opinions about you based on the information we have given him, which has been accurate and complete. He knows who you are, he knows what happened, he knows you were imprisoned without trial. He has also been told that you are his godfather and his legal guardian and that what happens with that relationship is his to decide." He paused. "I asked him this morning whether he wanted to meet you." Sirius looked at him. "What did he say?" "He said yes," Ragnarok said. "But he said he wanted to ask you something first, before he decided anything else." Sirius sat up a little straighter. "All right." Ragnarok stood, walked to the door, opened it. Harry was in the corridor. He'd been there for about 10 minutes, standing with his arms loosely at his sides, wearing a dark Gringotts-made tunic and trousers and the look of someone who was managing his own nerves through the simple mechanism of refusing to show them. He had Lily Potter's eyes and James Potter's hair and nothing else about him looked like either of them. He looked, instead, like himself, which was something distinct and specific, small for 7, slightly serious, watchful. He walked in. Sirius looked at him and something in his face broke open quietly, the way old ice does in spring, not dramatically, just, splitting along lines that had been under pressure for a very long time. Harry looked at him. Not with the automatic warmth that a child might extend to a long-lost family member. With assessment. With the careful attention of someone who'd been taught that what you saw in the first 30 seconds of meeting a person told you more than the next 30 minutes of conversation. "You're Sirius Black," Harry said. "Yeah," Sirius said. His voice was rough. "You didn't come on November 1st, Harry said. "Not accusatory. Just factual." "I didn't know," Sirius said. "I I went to Godric's Hollow first. And then I found Peter, and then, I should have come for you first. I know that. I know it every day." Harry looked at him for a moment. "That's what I wanted to know," he said. "Whether you'd tell me the truth about it or make up a reason that made you sound better." Sirius blinked. "How do you know I'm not?" "Because your hands are shaking," Harry said simply. Griphook says people's hands shake when they're saying something that costs them something. Sirius looked down at his hands. Then back up at Harry. Harry crossed the room and sat in the other visitor's chair, next to Sirius rather than across from him, and looked at Ragnarok. "Can you give us a few minutes?" he asked. Ragnarok looked at the 7-year-old who had just managed a first meeting better than most adults would have and felt something he had given up pretending not to feel by this point. "Of course," he said, and closed the door behind him. Sirius visited weekly after that. He had his own flat in London now, small, bare, in the process of being rebuilt into something habitable, and he came to Gringotts on Tuesday afternoons and sat with Harry in the small courtyard and told him stories about his parents. Not sanitized stories. Sirius Black was not a sanitizing kind of person, and Harry had made it clear from the second visit that he wanted the real version. So he got the real version. James Potter, who was brilliant and arrogant and got better. Lily Potter, who was terrifying and kind and had a sense of humor like a knife. The Marauders. Hogwarts. The war, as much of it as was appropriate for a 7-year-old, which was more than most people would have thought appropriate, but Harry asked precise questions and Sirius was incapable of lying to those eyes. Harry listened to all of it with his full attention and asked questions that occasionally made Sirius pause and look at him with a slightly unsettled expression, not because the questions were strange but because they were too perceptive, the kind of questions that a 7-year-old had no business asking, that went straight to the center of whatever the story was actually about. Did Dumbledore know Voldemort would come for my parents? Harry asked once, in the middle of a story about the Fidelius charm. Sirius had stopped. The Order had intelligence, yeah. He knew they were targets. But he knew before they died what Voldemort was trying to do. He knew Voldemort was after me specifically. I think so, yeah. And he already had the plan ready. To send me to Surrey. Harry said it flatly. He had it ready before November 1st. Sirius was quiet for a moment. Where did you get that? The contract was filed the same night, Harry said. Griphook showed me the timeline. 4 hours after Godric's Hollow. You can't write a contract like that in 4 hours, file it, have it processed. Someone had the paperwork ready. He knew they were going to die and he had the contingency ready. He looked at Sirius. Did he tell you about his plan for me? Sirius was very still. No, he said. He didn't. Harry nodded once, as if this confirmed something. He didn't say anything else about it that day. He was 9 when he read the contract himself. Not a summary. Not Griphook's explanation. The actual document, the 47-page filing with all its clauses and subclauses, including the secondary clause with the red border. Griphook had placed it in front of him and said, simply, "You're old enough." It took Harry 2 hours to read it. He read slowly, the way he'd been taught, every word, every clause, looking for the structure beneath the language. He made notes. He went back and reread sections. Twice he asked Griphook a specific legal vocabulary question and Griphook answered without elaborating, letting Harry come to his own conclusions. When he finished, he set the contract down on the table. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, very calmly, "What does Dumbledore want from me?" Griphook had known this question was coming. He'd thought about how to answer it for approximately 2 years. "He wants to use you," Griphook said. "Not cruelly. He believes in what he's doing. He thinks Voldemort is not fully gone and that you are, connected to the resolution of that. He wants to prepare you in a way that aligns with his plan for how that resolution should happen." "What's his plan?" "We don't know the specifics," Griphook said. "We know the shape of it. He wants you isolated until he's ready for you to be public. He wants you uninformed of your inheritance and your titles. He wants you dependent, on him, on the structures he controls." He paused. "He has been, since the night you arrived here, working to establish himself as your inevitable guardian, your guide, your authority. Every legal challenge, every attempt to regain custody, it is all aimed at the same end. He wants to be the person who explains the world to you." Harry looked at the contract. "So everything he does is strategic?" "Yes. And he's doing it because he thinks it's right." "Yes," Griphook said. "That is what makes him dangerous rather than simply opportunistic. Opportunists are predictable. True believers adapt." Harry was quiet again. He looked out the small window. They were in Griphook's office, one level down from Ragnar's, smaller and more crowded with books and files but lit better. The courtyard was visible below, the grated ceiling letting in a square of pale London sky. "He's been trying to take me back for 9 years, Harry said. "We've beaten every legal challenge he's filed. Every one so far. What happens when I'm 11? Griphook looked at him. "Hogwarts. He controls Hogwarts," Harry said. "He's the headmaster." "Yes. Can he use the school as a legal mechanism to override ward right?" "He will try," Griphook said. There is a precedent argument he could make, that compulsory magical education supersedes custodial arrangements. Copperthorne has been preparing the counter-argument for 3 years. Harry looked at the contract again. At the red-bordered secondary clause. At the line about 200 galleons from Vault 687. "Can I talk to Ragnarok?" he asked. About what I want to do. When I'm 11. What I think we should do." Griphook had looked at him. "He's been waiting for you to ask." At 10, Harry had his first blade lesson. Goblins didn't use wands. Their combat tradition was entirely different, ancient, close range, built around the principle that the best weapon was the one you could always carry, always access, and never have confiscated. The blade tradition was philosophical as much as physical. A goblin who carried a blade understood that they were responsible for their own protection, that no institution or authority guaranteed safety, and that competence was a form of respect both to yourself and to the thing you were competent with. The instructor was an ancient goblin named Steelgrip who had fought in both the 1752 and the 1865 rebellions and who regarded Harry's initial attempts with the expression of someone deeply committed to honesty. "Again," she said, for the 47th time that first session. Harry adjusted his grip, ran the footwork sequence, struck the practice target. "Better," Steelgrip said. This was, he would learn, the highest praise she offered. He was there every day for an hour. He was methodical about it, the same way he was methodical about everything, not brilliant overnight, but consistent, incremental, accumulative. By the end of the first month he had the basic sequences. By 3 months he had the weight of the blade internalized, the way it extended your reach and changed your balance. By 6 months Steelgrip had added a second blade and the lessons became something more interesting, about reading the opponent, about the information a person's feet gave you before their hands did, about how most fights were decided before the first strike landed. He trained in magic too, but differently. There was no formal curriculum, he wasn't at Hogwarts, had no textbook progression. Instead, his magic developed in response to problems. Ragnarok would present him with a puzzle, a word sequence that needed adjusting, an enchanted object that wasn't behaving correctly, a protection charm on a vault door that had developed a flaw. Harry would work on it, feel his way through it with that instinctive sensitivity that had read the emotional residue of ancient artifacts when he was 4, and either solve it or identify specifically why he couldn't yet. His wandless magic had developed almost without either of them noticing it was distinct from anything else. He'd been doing accidental wandless magic since age 2. Intentional wandless magic came at 8, nothing dramatic, small things, adjusting the temperature of objects, moving things within about 6 feet, lighting a lamp. At 10 he could move things across a room, could perform a basic shield charm without words or wand, and had, during one memorable lesson with Steelgrip, accidentally performed a locking spell on a door when he was trying to end the session early. Steelgrip had made him unlock it himself. Then she'd made him run the footwork sequence another 20 times. The parseltongue came at 9.5. There was a snake, not unusual in Gringotts. Snakes were traditional guardians in certain of the older vaults, a large green one that lived in Corridor 7 and was generally unbothered by goblins passing through but tended to regard humans with the cold assessment of something that had decided humans were more trouble than they were worth. Harry had been in Corridor 7 returning a ledger for Sharpclaw. He'd walked past the snake, and the snake had looked at him, and Harry had stopped. "You're in my corridor," the snake said. And Harry, without a moment's pause, had said back, "Sorry. I live here." The snake had regarded him for a moment. "You are the young human." "Yes. You are not like other humans." "No," Harry said. "I don't think so." He'd stood in the corridor and had a 5-minute conversation with the snake about the quality of the rats in the lower levels and whether the new vault installations were disturbing the nesting populations, and then he'd continued on with the ledger and hadn't thought very much about it until he mentioned it to Griphook later that evening and Griphook had become very still. "Say that again," Griphook said. Harry repeated it. "You spoke to the snake," Griphook said. "In its language." Didn't I? Harry looked uncertain for the first time. I mean, I thought I was speaking normally, but, Parseltongue, Griphook said. The language of serpents. It is an extremely rare ability. It is also, he paused, associated historically with Salazar Slytherin. Harry looked at him. I'm the Slytherin heir. You are, Griphook said. This may be part of what comes with it. It may also be connected to the scar, to the fragment of Voldemort in the scar, because Voldemort was also a Parseltongue and that ability came through the Slytherin line. He was watching Harry carefully. How do you feel about it? Harry thought about it honestly. I feel like it's mine, he said. Not his. It doesn't feel like something that came from outside. It feels like a language I always knew but didn't have a reason to use. Griphook nodded slowly. Then treat it as yours, he said. Because it is. Whatever its origin, it is in you and it answers to you. That makes it yours. Harry had gone back to Corridor 7 the next day and apologized to the snake for startling it. The snake had said, in its flat reptilian way, that apology was unnecessary but was noted as a mark of respect. Then it had told him that the rat situation in the lower levels had genuinely deteriorated and someone should do something about it. Harry had passed this along to the maintenance team. He was 10.5 when Ragnarok sat him down for the conversation they had both been moving toward for years. Hogwarts in 6 months, Ragnarok said. I know, Harry said. Dumbledore will be there. I know. He will attempt several things, Ragnarok said. He will attempt to get close to you. He will attempt to guide your education in specific directions. He will attempt to isolate you from the legal protections you have here. And he will attempt to present himself to you as an ally, possibly as a mentor, in a way designed to gradually override your existing relationships and loyalties. He looked at Harry steadily. He is genuinely charming, genuinely intelligent, and genuinely believes he is acting in your interest. That combination is more dangerous than someone who knows they are being manipulative. I know, Harry said again. You've studied his moves for 2 years, Ragnarok said. You know his methods. But knowing a method and experiencing it are different. He is very good at making people trust him. Harry looked at him. You're worried I'll be taken in by him. I'm making sure you're prepared for the experience of meeting someone who will feel, instinctively, like someone worth trusting. Harry was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I've thought about it. About Hogwarts. About what I want to do when I get there. He looked at Ragnarok directly. I don't want to hide. I don't want to play it small and cautious and wait for the right moment. I've waited, we've all waited, for 10 years, and the legal situation has moved as far as legal situations can move without a public moment. I want a public moment. Ragnarok looked at him. Define public moment. First day, Harry said. I want to take my seats. All of them. Wisengamot seats, I have 4 hereditary seats pending, nobody's claimed them, they're just sitting vacant because nobody's challenged the vacancy. I want to do it publicly, before I go to Hogwarts, or as part of arriving. He leaned forward slightly. And I want the blood contract presented. Not in a courtroom. Not in a legal filing. I want it presented publicly, where it can be seen. You are 11 years old, Ragnarok said. I will be 11 when the letter arrives, Harry said. But by the time I take those seats, I'll have done more preparation for this than most adults have done for anything in their lives. He met Ragnarok's eyes. You know that. Ragnarok looked at him for a long time. There it was. The thing he had been watching build for 10 years, in the forge, in the vault corridors, in the blade lessons and the ledger reviews and the late-night legal discussions. Not arrogance, nothing Harry did was arrogance, arrogance was confidence detached from justification. This was something quieter and more absolute. The particular certainty of a person who had done the work and knew exactly what they were capable of. I know that, Ragnock said. Then help me plan it, Harry said. Ragnock picked up his pen. From the beginning, he said. Chapter 4, The Letter. The Hogwarts letter arrived on a Tuesday. Harry knew it was coming, had known for months, had the date circled not on a calendar but in his head, the way he kept track of things that mattered, but there was still something about the moment that was different from anticipating it. The owl dropped it through the grated ceiling of the courtyard where he was running blade sequences with steel grip, and it fell in a neat arc and landed on the stone floor beside his foot, and he stopped mid-sequence and looked at it. Cream envelope. Green ink. The Hogwarts seal in red wax. Mr. H. Potter, The Medical Wing, Gringotts Bank, London. Steelgrip looked at the letter, then at Harry. Finish the sequence, she said. Harry finished the sequence. Then he picked up the letter. He didn't open it immediately. He turned it over in his hands, felt the weight of it, the specific texture of the parchment, the way the seal pressed into the wax with centuries of accumulated significance. He had known this letter was coming since he was old enough to understand what Hogwarts was, and he had spent years preparing for what came after it, and now it was here and it was just an envelope. He opened it, read it in about 15 seconds, and tucked it into his tunic. Done? Steelgrip asked. Done, he said, and picked his blade back up. He ran the sequence 6 more times before the session ended, and each time it was cleaner than the last. Griphook was waiting for him in the corridor outside the blade room, which meant Ragnock had told him to expect the letter today, which meant Ragnock had been watching the calendar too. Griphook held out a hand without speaking. Harry gave him the letter. Griphook read it, handed it back, and said, "Today, then." "Today," Harry agreed. They walked to Ragnock's office together. The plan had taken 6 months to build, and in that time it had been tested from every angle that Copperthorne's legal team could imagine and several that Ragnock had imagined himself and one that Harry had thought of at 2 in the morning and brought to Griphook over breakfast, blinking and slightly wild-eyed with the energy of someone who'd been awake thinking too long. It was solid. It was, by Copperthorne's assessment, either a masterpiece of legal strategy or an act of extraordinary provocation, and possibly both simultaneously. Harry considered that a favorable review. The Wizengamot had 4 vacant hereditary seats that belonged to him by right of blood, the Potter seat, the Black seat, the Peverell seat, and the Slytherin seat. Hereditary seats didn't require the holder to be of age, they required only that the holder be alive, identified, and formally registered as the claimant. Harry was alive, had been identified by blood inheritance scan 9 years ago, and the registration paperwork had been sitting in Copperthorne's files since Harry was 6, waiting for the right moment. The right moment was now. Because here was the specific architectural beauty of Ragnock's plan, the Hogwarts term began on September 1st. The Wizengamot's autumn session opened on September 3rd. If Harry claimed his seats before his first Hogwarts term, specifically, before he walked through those doors as a student, he would arrive at the school not as a child under Dumbledore's institutional authority, but as a sitting member of the governing body that Dumbledore's position as Chief Warlock technically served. It wouldn't immunize him. Dumbledore was still headmaster and the school was still his domain. But it changed the architecture of their relationship in a way that couldn't be undone. You couldn't treat a Wizengamot member as a ward, as a student in need of guidance, as someone whose legal affairs were your business to manage. The dynamic, once shifted, would be visible to everyone. And visibility was the point. The seat registration filing goes to the ministry today, Ragnock said when they came in, already at his desk, already moving. Copperthorne submitted it this morning. The ministry has 48 hours to object under procedural rules, and they have no grounds to object, so in 48 hours the seats are formally registered. Dumbledore will know within the hour, Griphook said. He will, Ragnock said, without visible concern. Let him know. Let him have 2 days to think about it. When Harry walks into the Wizengamot chamber on the 2nd of September to formally take his seats, Dumbledore can be there or not. Either way the record will show what it shows. Harry sat down. What about the contract? The contract, Ragnox said, is the second act. He looked at Harry steadily. You are certain about the timing? Public, Harry said. Not in a courtroom. Not in a legal filing. I want it in the Wisengamot chamber with every member present, on the record, so it can never be buried in a ministry archive and forgotten. It will be very difficult for Dumbledore, Ragnox said. Not as a caution. Just as a fact that needed stating. It should be, Harry said. Ragnox looked at him for a moment. It will also be difficult in ways that go beyond the legal. He is a man who has done a great deal of genuine good. People love him. When this comes out, it will hurt people who trusted him. I know, Harry said. And he did, he'd thought about this, sat with it, turned it over. But they trusted him with information that wasn't accurate. What he did was real regardless of whether people find it comfortable to know about it. The truth doesn't become kinder by being kept quiet. No, Ragnox said. It doesn't. He picked up his pen. Then we proceed. 2 days later, the ministry confirmed the seat registrations without fanfare, because there was genuinely nothing to object to, and the clerk who processed it either didn't realize the significance or had simply filed it alphabetically and moved on. The notification went out to the Wisengamot membership list, which meant that by Thursday evening, approximately 40% of the British wizarding political establishment was having some version of the conversation. Have you seen the Wisengamot membership update? Potter. All 4 seats. By Friday, Rita Skeeter had a story in the Daily Prophet, The Boy Who Lived, Where Has He Been? It was, Harry thought, reading it over breakfast, impressively inaccurate in its specifics while accidentally correct in its general thrust. She'd gotten that he was at Gringotts. She'd gotten that there were legal proceedings. She described him as being raised in mysterious seclusion by the Goblin Nation, which was not how he would have phrased it but wasn't entirely wrong. She described Dumbledore as unavailable for comment, which meant he had declined to comment, which meant he was thinking carefully about what to say. She'll want an interview, Griphook said from across the table. Eventually, Harry said. Not yet. She'll write it anyway. Let her. Anything she writes now is speculation. When I have something to say, I'll say it myself. He set the paper down. What time tomorrow? 10 o'clock, Griphook said. Formal entry to the Wisengamot chamber. You'll need robes. Harry looked at him. In 10 years of living in Gringotts, he had worn goblin-made clothing almost exclusively, practical, well-made, dark-colored, built for movement. Not wizard robes. I have robes, he said. You have one set, Griphook said. From 3 years ago. You've grown. Then we'll get robes today. They went to Madame Malkin's that afternoon, and the trip was the first time Harry had been in Diagon Alley as a recognizable person. He wasn't sure exactly who recognized him first, possibly the witch at the apothecary next door who looked out her window and went very still, but within about 3 minutes of arriving at Malkin's, a small crowd had gathered on the pavement outside the window with the studied casualness of people who were definitely not staring. He ignored them. He stood on the fitting platform and let Madame Malkin work, and when she asked what style he wanted he said, practical. Dark. Nothing that restricts movement. Madame Malkin, who had been dressing Wizarding Britain for 40 years, looked at him with bright eyes. You sound like your father, she said. He said the same thing every time. Harry looked at her in the mirror. What did you make him, in the end? Deep blue, she said. He always argued for black, I always talked him out of it. She studied Harry's reflection. You, though, I think black is correct. You've earned it. Harry looked at himself in the mirror. Dark hair, green eyes, the faint scar along his jaw that Iron Teeth had warned him about 10 years ago and which had faded to something barely visible. The forehead scar covered by his hair, the way it usually was. 11 years old, which looked strange to him when he thought about it, because inside he didn't feel 11 and outside, Griphook had said more than once, he didn't look it either. Black, he confirmed. The crowd outside had grown. Griphook was at the door, arms folded, watching the pavement with the expression of someone doing threat assessment on a crowd of curious wizards and tentatively concluding that curious was the operative word rather than dangerous. A small red-haired girl about Harry's age pushed to the front of the crowd, looked straight through the window, caught Harry's eye, and grinned with the total unself-consciousness of someone who hadn't yet learned that staring was rude. Harry blinked. Then, surprised, he almost smiled. She disappeared back into the crowd before he could do anything about it. The morning of September 2nd came in clear and cold. Harry was awake before dawn. He'd slept fine, not the anxious sleeplessness of the night before something frightening, but the light, ready sleep of the night before something you've been working toward for a long time. He ran his blade sequences in the courtyard in the dark, partly for the discipline and partly because his hands needed something to do, and by the time Gringotts was waking up around him he was calm in the way he was always calm, not the absence of feeling but the presence of focus. He dressed in the new black robes. They sat well. He checked his reflection once, adjusted nothing, and went to find Ragnarok. The contingent that walked into the Ministry of Magic that morning was small and deliberately composed. Ragnarok, in full Chief Vault Master formal dress, which was the goblin equivalent of showing up in full military honors. Copperthorn, carrying a briefcase that Harry knew contained, among other things, the 47-page document with the red border. Griphook, whose expression said that he was perfectly aware of the significance of this and had committed to looking like he did this every day. Sirius Black, who had, after 2 years of visiting Tuesday afternoons and telling Harry stories about his parents, grown into something that was not yet quite what Harry imagined a godfather was supposed to be but was real and present in wearing clean robes for the first time in Harry's memory. And Harry. They walked through the ministry atrium and people noticed. Of course they noticed, Ragnarok in formal dress was notable enough. But it was Harry they watched, with the specific quality of attention that came from a decade of wondering where he was. The whispers started almost immediately. It's him, isn't it, the Potter boy, he's been at Gringotts this whole time, look at him. Harry walked through it like it was weather. The Wizengamot chamber was on the second level. It was a large circular room with tiered seating arranged in a horseshoe, the seat of British wizarding law for 8 centuries, and it was already nearly full when they arrived because the word had gotten out and 3/4 of the membership had decided they needed to be present for whatever this was. Dumbledore was there. He was in his chief warlock's seat at the center of the chamber, wearing the formal purple robes, and he watched Harry enter the room with an expression that Harry had imagined for years without quite getting right. It was not hostility. It was not guilt. It was something more complicated and more careful, the expression of a very intelligent man recalculating from a position he hadn't expected to find himself in. Harry met his eyes across the chamber. He held the look for exactly long enough to communicate that he wasn't unsettled by it. Then he walked to the floor of the chamber where visitors addressed the assembly, and he stood there and let the room settle into silence, and he waited until the silence was complete. "My name is Hadrian James Potter," he said. His voice was steady and clear and carried to every tier. "I am presenting for formal seat registration on behalf of 4 hereditary Wizengamot positions, Potter, Black, Peverell, and Slytherin. The registration documentation is in order. I believe the chamber has been notified." A murmur ran around the room. Madame Longbottom, in the Longbottom seat 3 tiers up, was watching him with sharp eyes and the expression of someone who had just revised their expectations upward. Several members were simply staring. The Wizengamot clerk, a thin nervous man named Wicker who looked like he wanted to be somewhere else, shuffled his papers. "The documentation has been received and verified. The seats are available for formal claim." "Thank you," Harry said. He walked to the Potter seat, placed his hand on the armrest, and said, in a clear voice, the hereditary claim words that Griphook had spent 3 weeks making sure he had exactly right. A faint light moved through the chair's surface, old magic, recognition magic, the kind built into the physical structure of the chamber in the 1st century of the Wisengamot's existence. He did it 3 more times. Black. Peveril. Slytherin. At Slytherin, a genuine ripple of noise went through the chamber, quickly suppressed. When it was done, he stood in the center of the chamber floor with all 4 formal acknowledgements complete, and the Wisengamot clerk was writing very fast, and approximately 60 British wizarding lawmakers were having a silent collective crisis about their assumptions. Dumbledore had not spoken. Harry looked at him again. "Chief Warlock," he said. "I believe there is a matter of record that should be addressed before this assembly adjourns." Dumbledore's expression shifted very slightly. "Mr. Potter, perhaps this might be better handled in this chamber is the appropriate venue for a matter of public record," Harry said. He wasn't sharp about it. He didn't need to be. Copperthorne. Copperthorne opened his briefcase and withdrew the document. He walked it to the Wisengamot clerk's table and set it down. "This is a guardianship transfer agreement filed on the 1st of November, 1981, using emergency Chief Warlock powers," Harry said to the chamber. "It transferred my legal guardianship to a Muggle woman in Surrey. It was filed 4 hours after my parents died. The named guardian in my parents' will, Sirius Black, currently seated in this chamber, was not consulted. The emergency provision invoked requires all named guardians to be dead or permanently incapacitated. Sirius Black was alive, and was subsequently imprisoned without trial for 2 years, meaning the provision was not only incorrectly applied but was applied in circumstances that appear to have been deliberately manufactured." The chamber was so quiet that Harry could hear someone breathing on the upper tier. "The contract also contains a secondary clause," Harry said. "It records a payment, from my own family vault, to the Muggle woman who took guardianship of me. 200 galleons initially, 100 galleons annually. I was sold. Technically, legally, bureaucratically, with ministry filing numbers and the Chief Warlock's seal. But sold." He looked at Dumbledore. "I am presenting this document as a matter of public record, so that it is witnessed, noted, and cannot be buried or amended. It is already lodged with the International Court of Magical Agreements, where proceedings have been ongoing for 9 years. But courts are private. This chamber is not." He picked up the document himself, and he held it up so the chamber could see the red border, so they could see the seal, so they could see the name on the bottom of the primary page. APWB Dumbledore. Sirius, in the black seat, was absolutely still. His hands were flat on the armrests, and his jaw was tight, and he was looking at Dumbledore with the expression of a man who had suspected something for 2 years and was having it confirmed in public. Madame Longbottom made a sound that wasn't quite a word but communicated a great deal. Dumbledore looked at Harry. He had gone very still, the way powerful people went still when they were managing something significant, not frozen, just contained. When he spoke, his voice was what it always was, measured, carrying weight, the voice of someone who had spoken to this chamber for decades and knew its acoustics. "What Harry has presented is accurate," he said. "I did file that contract. I did invoke the emergency provision." He paused. "I did so because I had reason to believe, information I cannot fully share even now without compromising ongoing security matters, that the child was in extraordinary danger. That the threat to him was not ended by what happened at Godric's Hollow. That isolating him was the only way to protect him until the threat could be properly assessed and addressed." He looked at Harry. "I will not apologize for trying to keep you alive." "The payment," someone on the upper tier said. Madame Longbottom, Harry realized. Her voice was flat. "A practical necessity," Dumbledore said. "The Dursley family had no obligation, from his own vault," Madame Longbottom said. "You paid them from his own vault." "The Potter estate is his," she said. "Not yours. Not the ministry's. His." She looked at Harry, then back at Dumbledore. with the expression of a woman who had respected a man for 40 years and was in the process of re-evaluating that investment. The question before this chamber, Chief Warlock, is not whether your intentions were good. It is whether your actions were lawful and whether this institution, whose authority you hold, was used correctly. She looked around the chamber. I move that a formal inquiry be opened. 3 voices seconded it within 5 seconds. Dumbledore looked at Harry. Harry looked back. He felt, and he'd been ready for this, had prepared himself for this, but the preparation and the reality were different. He felt the full weight of what he'd done. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Something more measured than either. He had told the truth in a room full of people who needed to hear it, and now the room would do what rooms of people did with difficult truths, and that was its own process and not his to control. He had done his part. He sat down in the Potter seat. The session ran for another 2 hours and Harry said almost nothing else. He didn't need to. The document was on the clerk's table and the Wisengamot clerk was making copies, and Madame Longbottom's motion had passed 41 to 19 and the formal inquiry was now on the books, and Dumbledore had, with the composure of someone who had not survived a century of politics by being undone in a single session, transitioned smoothly into cooperative mode, acknowledging the inquiry, acknowledging the chamber's authority, framing himself as someone who had always intended to work within the process and had simply moved fast in a crisis. He was very good at it. Harry watched him work the room during the break and thought about what Griphook had said years ago, true believers adapt. Dumbledore wasn't beaten. He wasn't even close to beaten. He had just been publicly challenged in a way that would require him to fight on legal ground rather than political ground, and that was a different kind of war, and Harry had 10 years of preparation for exactly that kind. Sirius found him during the break, in the corridor outside the chamber. He looked like he was managing something complicated. His face was controlled but his hands were in his pockets, which Harry had learned meant Sirius was keeping them there deliberately. You could have told me, Sirius said, that you were going to do it today. I did tell you, Harry said. I told you the plan. You told me the general shape of the plan. You didn't tell me I'd be sitting in that chamber when you said it. He was quiet for a moment. Hearing it said out loud. In public. With the document up there. His voice had gone rough at the edges. I needed a second. Harry looked at him. Then he did something that surprised both of them. He stepped forward and put his hand briefly on Sirius's arm. It was not a long gesture. Harry was not, by nature, a demonstrative person. But it was real. I know, Harry said. I'm sorry it took this long. Sirius looked at the hand on his arm. He swallowed once. James would have, he stopped. He would have loved you, he said. He would have been so bloody proud. Harry didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just stood there for a moment, in the corridor outside the chamber, before the second half of the session began and the machinery of it all resumed. After the session, Dumbledore appeared. Not ambushingly, he waited, with the specific patience of a man who understood that forcing a confrontation was less effective than creating a space where one could occur naturally. He was standing near the chamber doors when Harry came out, talking to 2 members of the Wisengamot with the easy warmth of long acquaintance, and Harry would have had to actively avoid him to not pass within speaking distance. Harry did not actively avoid him. He stopped. Ragnarok, 2 steps behind him, stopped also. Griphook stopped and went very still and watchful. Harry, Dumbledore said. He dismissed himself from the other conversation with a smile and a gesture. Up close, he was older than the distant figure from the chamber, the lines in his face were deeper, the silver beard longer, and his eyes, behind the half-moon spectacles, were exactly as sharp as Ragnarok had always said they would be. But there was also something else in them. Something that wasn't strategic. Genuine grief, Harry thought. Or something close to it. Professor Dumbledore, Harry said. Something moved in Dumbledore's expression at the formal address. "I have been looking forward to meeting you properly for 11 years, he said. "Circumstances being what they are, that sentence carries more weight than it probably should." "Circumstances being what they are," Harry said evenly, "most sentences do." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. He looked at Harry with the specific quality of attention that Harry recognized from descriptions, the sensation of being seen entirely, of having someone look at you and read the whole picture. "You've been well prepared," he said. "I've been well raised," Harry said. "There's a difference." "Indeed there is." The old man held his gaze. "I hope you will believe me when I say that I never wished you harm." "I believe you," Harry said, and he meant it, he genuinely meant it, which was the complicated thing he'd been carrying for 2 years since reading the contract and realizing that intention and impact were not the same thing and could coexist in the same person. "I also believe that what you did caused harm." "Both things are true." Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. "You are very like your mother," he said quietly. "She had the same clarity." "I'd like to hear more about her," Harry said. "Eventually. When this is further along." Something in Dumbledore's face shifted. Surprise, Harry thought. He hadn't expected that. "I would like that," he said. "Very much." He nodded once to Ragnarok, who returned it with the formal acknowledgement of someone completing a professional courtesy, and walked away through the ministry corridor. Griphook, when he was out of earshot, said, "You told him you wanted to talk about your mother." "Yes," Harry said. "Why?" "Because he knew her and I didn't," Harry said. "And being angry at him forever doesn't change that, and it doesn't do anything useful." He started walking. "I can hold someone accountable and still want what they have. Those aren't in conflict." Griphook walked alongside him. "Most humans would find them in conflict." "Most humans," Harry said, "didn't grow up in Gringotts." Hogwarts Express left from King's Cross the following morning at 11 o'clock. Sirius had offered to take him. Harry had, after a moment's consideration, said yes, and then also yes to Ragnarok coming, which had produced a brief silence before Ragnarok said, simply, "All right," in the voice of a goblin pretending he hadn't been hoping to be asked. Platform 9 3/4 was everything the descriptions had suggested and considerably louder. Harry stepped through the barrier into the noise and the steam and the smell of it, coal smoke and magic and the particular excitement of several hundred children at the beginning of something, and took it in. He had a trunk. Inside it was a wand he'd gotten the day before, 11 inches, holly and phoenix feather, from Ollivander himself, who had made a sound when Harry had picked it up and wielded it that Griphook described later as ominous but excited, which is the worst possible combination in a wand maker. He had books, proper Hogwarts books plus considerably more besides. He had the snake leather blade case, the blades inside it, because he wasn't going anywhere without those. He had the bronze mirror from his room in Gringotts because he'd gotten used to seeing it there. He had a small copy of Goblin Contract Law that Griphook had pressed into his hand at breakfast without comment. Ragnarok stood on the platform with his hands behind his back and watched the crowd with the expression of someone doing comprehensive threat assessment on a gathering of children and parents. "You're going to be fine," Sirius said. He was trying to be casual about it and mostly succeeding. "I know," Harry said. "You don't have to," Sirius paused. "You can just be a student, you know. You don't have to be, you can let it be just school. Some of it." Harry looked at him. He thought about what Sirius was actually saying, that the weight of the last 10 years, the legal battles and the preparation and the very public mourning in the Wizengamot, that it didn't have to follow him through every door. That he could, sometimes, just be 11. "Some of it," Harry said. "Yeah." Sirius smiled, the real one, not the managed version he wore when he was trying to look more stable than he felt. "Good." Harry turned to Ragnarok. Ragnarok looked at him. 10 years of mornings in Gringotts corridors, blade sessions and vault rides and late-night legal discussions, and Ragnar's face was exactly as it had always been, precise, contained, and completely unreadable to anyone who hadn't spent 10 years learning to read it. Harry had spent 10 years learning to read it. "Thank you," Harry said. He meant the whole 10 years. He meant the night on November 1st when a goblin had opened a door in the rain and looked down and not turned away. He meant all of it. Ragnar held his gaze. "Do not embarrass Gringotts," he said. "Never," Harry said. Something in Ragnar's face shifted, that minimal fractional movement that Harry had learned was the equivalent of a very significant expression. "Good," he said. "Now go." Harry picked up his trunk. He walked toward the train, and the crowd parted around him the way crowds do around someone who moves with purpose, and somewhere behind him he heard Sirius say something quiet to Ragnar that he didn't quite catch, and he heard Ragnar reply in 2 words that he also didn't catch but whose tone was not unkind. He found a compartment that was empty, stowed his trunk, and sat down. For about 30 seconds, it was quiet. Just the platform noise outside and the steam and the distant whistle of the train preparing to go. The compartment door slid open. A girl came in. Red hair, freckles, the same direct look from the window of Madame Malkin's 3 days ago. The grin was currently in storage but the eyes were just as unself-conscious. "You're Harry Potter," she said. Not the odd version that most of the platform was deploying. Just a fact, offered without ceremony. "Yes," Harry said. "I'm Ginny Weasley," she said. "I'm not actually supposed to be on this side of the platform. First years are supposed to wait by the barrier, but the twins told me to explore and they were going to get in trouble for it, so I thought I might as well do it usefully." She paused. "Can I sit here until it's time?" Harry looked at her. That assessment he always did, reading the 30 seconds. What he got was, direct, comfortable with herself, used to a large family and therefore comfortable with noise and crowds and being overlooked, currently making a deliberate choice to be here rather than doing what she was told. "Yes," he said. She sat down across from him and looked at him with the frank curiosity of someone who had decided staring was acceptable in these circumstances. "The twins said you were at Gringotts this whole time." "Yes." "The twins also said you did something at the Wisengamot yesterday that made Dad have a very serious conversation on the floor that lasted 45 minutes and ended with him saying, 'Well, he's not wrong,' 3 times. She tilted her head. "Dad's in the ministry. He thinks you're either going to change everything or set it on fire." "Hopefully both," Harry said. She grinned. The full version this time, the one that had been in storage. It was, he thought, a remarkably straightforward grin, no performance in it, just genuine amusement, uncomplicated. "I like that answer," she said. Outside, the train whistle went, and the platform erupted in the final chaos of last-minute goodbyes, and Ginny Weasley looked out the window at the crowd and said, "That's my mum crying. She does that every year. It's not efficient." "No," Harry said. "She'll be worse when I actually leave next year." "Probably." The train began to move and Ginny pressed her face briefly to the window to wave, and Harry watched the platform sliding away, Sirius raising one hand, Ragnar standing perfectly still as he always did, the steam beginning to close around them, and felt, for the first time, the specific sensation of a chapter genuinely ending and another beginning. Not fear. Not nostalgia. Just the clean awareness of a threshold. The platform disappeared. London began to slide past the windows, and the compartment was quiet, and Ginny Weasley turned from the window and said, with perfect conversational transition, "What's it actually like, growing up in a bank?" Harry looked at her. "Educational," he said. She waited for more. "The porridge tastes like copper," he added. She considered this. "That sounds terrible." "You get used to it." The train gathered speed, and the city fell away into countryside, and Harry Potter was, for the first time in his life, going somewhere that was not Gringotts, going towards something rather than preparing for it, and the boy who had crawled across wet cobblestones 10 years ago as a baby sat in a Hogwarts Express compartment across from a girl who talked like someone who had never learned to be quiet, and the holly wand in his trunk hummed faintly with accumulated potential, and the forehead scar was still. The sorting was at 8 o'clock. Harry had arrived at Hogwarts the way he arrived everywhere, ahead of whatever the standard expectation was, watching the castle from the boats with the same focused attention he'd given the deep vaults at age 4. It was impressive. He acknowledged that freely. 900 years of stone and magic and institutional history, all of it present in the weight and height of it rising over the lake. He sat in the boat with 3 first-years who had introduced themselves in the way of people operating on pure social adrenaline. Hermione Granger, who had already been reading her advanced transfiguration text on the train and had spotted Harry reading the Goblin contract law book and given him a very sharp, very considering look. Neville Longbottom, who was Madame Longbottom's grandson and who had looked at Harry on the train with a mixture of recognition and the wariness of someone who had grown up hearing about a name. And a boy with white blonde hair and the family bearing of old money who had introduced himself as Draco Malfoy and then gone very still when Harry had looked at him with perfect neutrality and said, "I know your mother." Draco had spent the rest of the boat ride recalibrating. The Great Hall. The candles. The ceiling charm to reflect the night sky, which Harry thought was the kind of architectural detail that communicated genuine love of magic rather than institutional practicality. The sorting hat was placed on a stool and sang its song, which Harry listened to with the specific attention he gave everything. His name was called third. The hall had been doing the thing it always did with names, responding with appropriate recognition, but when McGonagall said Potter, Harry, the silence was different. Complete. The kind that had weight. Harry walked to the stool with the same stride he used everywhere, not performance, not aggression, just the natural movement of someone who was going somewhere with a purpose. He sat down and the hat was lowered onto his head. It settled over his eyes and for a moment there was nothing but darkness and the faint smell of old felt and centuries of accumulated magical contact, and then a voice said, "Well, you're not what I expected." "I never am," Harry thought back. "For bloodlines," the hat said. Its voice was thoughtful, turning him over the way an experienced reader turns over a complex book. Extraordinary potential. 10 years of goblin-made education. Blade training. Legal strategy. A mind that works like a vault mechanism, precise, multi-layered, always looking for the structural point. And? Harry thought. And a boy who held a goblin's finger in the dark when he was 15 months old and hasn't stopped holding on to things that matter since. Interesting combination. A pause. You know where you belong. Yes, Harry thought simply. Then let's not waste anyone's time, the hat said, and raised its brim and shouted, to the great hall and the enchanted ceiling and the 4 house tables and every teacher sitting at the high table and the headmaster in his central chair, Slytherin. The Slytherin table erupted. The rest of the hall was doing various versions of surprise, calculation, and noise. Hermione Granger, sitting in the waiting group, looked thoughtful. Neville Longbottom blinked. Draco Malfoy looked like something had worked out significantly better than expected. Harry sat down at the Slytherin table and the boy next to him, older, a prefect, said, automatically, "Welcome to," and then seemed to realize who he was talking to and finished with, "Slytherin." Obviously. Obviously, Harry agreed pleasantly. He looked up at the high table. Dumbledore was watching him with those sharp, old eyes, and his expression was the most honest Harry had seen it since the Wizengamot, not the managed warmth, not the deliberate calm, just genuine assessment, reading the board, adjusting. Harry looked back at him without expression and without heat, the way you looked at a problem you had studied thoroughly and were ready to solve. Then he looked away, at the rest of the hall, at the ceiling full of stars, at this strange new place that was already being folded into the architecture of what he was building. He was here. Let everything that came next begin. Chapter 5, The Chessboard. The first week of Hogwarts was, by Harry's assessment, approximately 40% interesting and 60% people trying to figure out what to do with him. The students had developed several competing theories about Harry Potter by Wednesday. The Slytherins had broadly decided he was an asset and were managing their enthusiasm with the careful restraint of people who understood that being too eager communicated weakness. The Gryffindors were split between wariness and fascination in roughly equal measure, with one notable exception, a boy named Ron Weasley, Ginny's brother, who had come up to Harry in the corridor on Tuesday with the direct energy of someone who had decided that thinking about it too much was counterproductive and said, simply, "You talked to Ginny on the train. She said you were decent. That's good enough for me," and then offered his hand. Harry had shaken it. Ron had looked relieved in a way that suggested he'd been working up to that since Monday. The Ravenclaws watched him with academic interest. The Hufflepuffs were friendly and slightly uncertain, and he appreciated that about them. The uncertainty was honest. The teachers were a different problem. Professor Flitwick taught charms with the bouncy enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved his subject, and on the first day he had demonstrated a Wingardium Leviosa with a feather and then asked the class to try. Most of them managed it by the end of the lesson. Harry had managed it on the first attempt, which Flitwick had noted with bright eyes and a small sound of pleasure, and Harry had then, because this was who he was and hiding it had never been the plan, spent the rest of the lesson helping the students on either side of him, which had produced a complicated expression on Flitwick's face that was primarily delight with some professional recalibration around the edges. Professor McGonagall taught transfiguration and made no pretense of treating Harry differently from anyone else, which Harry respected immediately. She had her standards and she applied them uniformly, and when Harry transfigured his match into a needle on the first try and then looked at it critically and said, "The tip needs to be sharper," she had looked at him with the expression of someone suppressing something and said, "Correct. Try again." He had. "Better." She had nodded once. After class she'd said, quietly, to catch him before he left, "My office. Thursday. 3 o'clock. Not a question." Harry had nodded and gone. Defense against the dark arts was taught by a man named Quirrell who wore a turban and stuttered and smelled like garlic and who Harry had noticed, on the first day of class, was wrong. Not wrong in the way a bad teacher was wrong. Wrong in the specific way the old vault artifacts had been wrong when he was 4, an internal discordance, a wrongness of resonance. Something about the back of Quirrell's head, specifically, produced the faintest echo of the sensation he knew from his forehead scar, that discordant wrong note frequency of a magic that didn't belong where it was. Harry sat through the first defense lesson with this information and said nothing about it to anyone except Griphook, in a letter that evening, which read, "The defense teacher is not what he appears to be. The resonance is familiar. I'm watching it." Griphook's reply came by return owl the next morning, "Be careful and be certain before you act. Watch where he goes. Note patterns. We will look into him from this end." He had not yet told Ragnarok. He wanted more information first. McGonagall's office was exactly what he expected, orderly, functional, a small fire in the grate, a tartan-pattern tin of biscuits on the shelf that had clearly been there since the 1960s. She sat behind her desk and gestured to the chair across from her. He sat. She looked at him for a long moment with those sharp eyes that didn't miss much. "I was at your parents' house," she said, "on the morning of November 1st, 1981. I spent the day watching Privet Drive as a cat before Dumbledore arrived. I told him that leaving you with the Dursleys was the wrong decision." She paused. "He overrode me." Harry waited. "I want you to know," she said, "that I have been watching the legal proceedings for 9 years and that my position throughout has been that what was done was incorrect. I did not take action beyond expressing disagreement because," she stopped, and he could see her choosing her words with precision, "because I believed Dumbledore's judgment on the larger picture even when I disagreed with his methods. I am no longer certain that distinction holds." "Why are you telling me this?" Harry asked. "Because you will be in my house," she caught herself, then corrected, "in Slytherin, but in this school, and I want you to know that there is at least one teacher in this castle who is not operating on Dumbledore's timeline. She looked at him steadily. I am also telling you because I think you deserve to hear it from me rather than infer it. Harry looked at her. The 30 seconds of assessment. What he got was, deeply principled, internally conflicted in a way she was actively working through, rigorously honest even when honesty was uncomfortable, and genuinely concerned about him in a way that was impersonal enough to be trustworthy. She wasn't trying to attach herself to him, she was trying to be accountable. Thank you, he said. Actually, thank you. She nodded briskly. Now. Your transfiguration work. The needle was good, but you're not using the wand correctly for that class of transformation. The wandless habit is affecting your form, you're relying on intent and not learning the precise wand movement, which will matter when the magic gets complex enough that intent alone isn't sufficient architecture. Harry blinked. Then he pulled out his wand. They spent 45 minutes on technique. She was a ferocious teacher, demanding, specific, zero tolerance for sloppiness, and Harry left her office with 3 corrections to his fundamental form and the feeling of someone who had just been productively challenged, which was a feeling he liked. Hermione Granger had decided, by the end of the first week, that Harry Potter was simultaneously the most interesting and most aggravating person she'd encountered in 11 years of life. Interesting because he clearly knew things that weren't in any of the textbooks, legal things, historical things, things about the nature of magic that he'd drop into conversation with the offhandedness of someone for whom they were simply background knowledge. In charms he'd explained the theoretical underpinning of a levitation charm to the person next to him in a way that made the textbook explanation look like a child summary. In transfiguration he'd produced the best needle in the class on his first try and then had a 40-minute private session with McGonagall that he'd emerged from looking focused rather than chastened, which suggested she'd taught him something genuinely difficult rather than corrected an error. Aggravating because he didn't explain himself. He just did things, and the things were always interesting, and when you asked him about it he gave you a complete and accurate answer that somehow still felt like the surface of something much larger. She had sat down across from him in the library on Friday afternoon with the directness of someone who had decided that circling the subject was inefficient. How do you know about ward theory? She said. It's not in the first-year curriculum. It's not in the second-year curriculum. I checked. Harry looked up from the book he was reading, not a textbook, she noted. Something old, in a script she didn't recognize. I grew up in Gringotts, he said. They use ward theory constantly. You learn it by proximity. Proximity isn't a teaching method. Goblin educators would disagree with you, he said. He closed the book. Why are you asking? Because in Charms on Wednesday you described the magical mechanics of the levitation charm in terms of intent architecture and material resonance, which is not first-year vocabulary, and the student you were explaining it to suddenly got it after struggling for 20 minutes. I want to know where you learned to explain it that way. Harry looked at her for a moment. Grip hook, he said. My account manager at Gringotts. He explains things by going to the structural principle first and then working out from there. Once you understand why a spell works the way it does, the how is intuitive. Hermione sat very still for a moment. That's exactly how I think about it, she said. But no one else seems to. Most people learn the how first and never get to the why, Harry said. It's faster in the short term. Less useful in the long term. She looked at him. He looked back. There was a moment of the particular recognition that happened between people whose minds worked similarly and who had, up until this point, not met very many of those. I'm going to sit here, she said, opening her own books. All right, Harry said, and opened his. They worked in silence for 2 hours and it was, for both of them, one of the more productive Friday afternoons they'd had. Draco Malfoy had been trying to have a private conversation with Harry since the sorting, and Harry had been allowing him to circle without making it easy, which was its own kind of message. It wasn't hostility. Harry had nothing against Draco specifically, the boy was sharp, well-educated by pure-blood standards, and had inherited his mother's quality of mind along with his father's reflexive confidence. What he hadn't inherited, or hadn't yet, was his mother's strategic patience. He was still working on the Malfoy model, which was power displayed rather than power deployed, and Harry found that approach mostly tedious. He allowed the conversation in the Slytherin common room on Saturday evening. Draco sat across from him in one of the green leather chairs by the fire, and for a moment he was doing the thing he did when he was trying to look casual, which was slightly too careful to be casual. Then he seemed to decide to drop it, which Harry appreciated. "My mother wrote to me," Draco said. "She said you were, that she had found working with Gringotts productive." "Your mother is useful," Harry said. "I told Ragnarok as much." Draco processed this. The word useful from Harry, he seemed to understand, was not a diminishment. "She wanted me to," she said, "to be straightforward with you. She said you'd find it more productive than the standard approach." "She's right. She usually is." He paused. "My father doesn't know she's been in contact with Gringotts. He thinks she's been managing family legal matters." He met Harry's eyes. "I'm telling you that because she told me to tell you. So you have the complete picture." Harry looked at him steadily. There was something genuine in this, Draco giving him his mother's message precisely, not editing it for his own benefit. It was a small thing, and it was also not a small thing. "What does she want from me?" Harry asked. "She wants the Black family name restored to what it should be," Draco said. "She wants Sirius Black to have his formal clearing, on the record, not just a release. She wants the family tapestry to reflect what's actually true." He paused. "And I think she wants you to know that whatever your father's family was to you, your mother's side, the Black side, she considers that a real thing. Not just political." Harry thought about Sirius, who came on Tuesday afternoons and whose hands still shook sometimes. "Tell her I know," he said. "And that I'm working on Sirius's formal clearing. Copperthorn is handling it." He paused. "Tell her I'd like to meet her properly. When there's time." Draco exhaled very slightly, a small release of tension he'd been carrying through the conversation. "All right. Then, with the particular quality of someone transitioning to their own interests, what are you actually planning to do this year? Because I heard what happened at the Wizengamot and I have thoughts." "I'm sure you do," Harry said. "The inquiry into Dumbledore is open, but it's going to move slowly because half the members don't want it to move at all. You know that. I know that. And Dumbledore still runs this school. Which means whatever he's planning for you, you're in his house, metaphorically. I know that too. So what's the plan?" Draco asked. Not the way someone asked when they wanted to insert themselves into a plan. The way someone asked when they genuinely wanted to understand the shape of the board. Harry considered him for a moment. "The plan," he said, "is to be very good at school, be very good at the things I'm good at, be visible and accurate and public so that every move Dumbledore makes toward me happens in the open where everyone can see it. He can't maneuver me in the shadows if there are no shadows." Draco was quiet. It's not very Slytherin," he said finally. Slytherin is usually shadow," Harry said. "I know. But shadow works for people who need to hide their power. I don't." He looked at the fire. Salazar Slytherin was a pragmatist. He hid because the world he lived in required hiding to survive. The world I live in is different. He looked back at Draco. "In this world, the most disruptive thing I can do is be completely, entirely visible and completely, entirely capable. It removes every possible move from the board except responding to me directly." Draco thought about this for a longer moment than most people would have. Then he said, "That's actually quite elegant." "Your mother would say so," Harry said. Quirrell got worse as October went on. Specifically, The wrong note resonance got stronger on the days when Harry suspected something was happening with the third-floor corridor, which was cordoned off and supposedly dangerous, and which Harry had identified within his first week as the location of something significant that Dumbledore was protecting. He had told Griphook. Griphook had told Ragnarok. Ragnarok had come back, through the letter chain, with something concrete, a philosopher's stone, Flamels, moved from Gringotts Vault 713 in July. Someone had tried to steal it from Gringotts first and failed. It was now here, being protected by a series of enchantments and obstacles in a corridor on the third floor of a school full of children, which Ragnarok had described in his letter as a decision of staggering irresponsibility that I have noted in our formal file on the subject. Harry had read this and thought for a long time. Then he'd written back, I think Quirrell is working for what's left of Voldemort. I think the stone is the goal. I think Dumbledore knows the stone is in danger and is using this school as a trap, with the stone as bait, and hasn't told anyone, including me, because in his plan I'm a variable he hasn't accounted for yet. What do I do? Ragnarok's reply had been a single sentence. What do you think you should do? Harry had set the letter down and thought about it for 3 days. He went to see Dumbledore on a Thursday in late October. He knocked on the office door, behind the gargoyle, which he'd identified by his second week, and waited, and the door opened, and the gargoyle moved, and the spiral staircase appeared. Harry rode it up and knocked on the inner door. Come in, Dumbledore said. The office was extraordinary. Harry had expected that, had been told about it, but the reality of it was still something. The portraits of past headmasters sleeping in their frames. The peculiar silver instruments on their spindle-legged tables, clicking and whirring and emitting small puffs of smoke. The sorting hat on its shelf. Fawkes, the phoenix, on his perch, who looked at Harry with one bright eye and made a low sound that was not quite a note. Dumbledore was at his desk. He looked at Harry over his spectacles with an expression that was genuinely unsurprised. He'd been expecting this, Harry thought, possibly for a while. Harry, he said warmly. Sit down. I've been hoping you'd come. I'm sure you have, Harry said pleasantly, and sat. Dumbledore folded his hands on the desk. Between them, the air between them, was the accumulated weight of everything that had happened and everything that hadn't, and both of them knew it, and neither of them made the mistake of pretending otherwise. Quirrell, Harry said. Dumbledore was very still for a fraction of a second. What about Professor Quirrell? He's not what he appears to be, Harry said. You know that. I know that. I suspect you've known since September and you've been watching it develop. He paused. I also know about the stone. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. You are very well informed. Yes, Harry agreed. May I ask how? Gringotts moved it from Vault 713 in July, Harry said. Ragnarok tracks all significant vault movements. The timing correlates with a break-in attempt that same day, which correlates with when Quirrell disappeared over the summer and came back, changed. He looked at Dumbledore steadily. You put it here because you thought the protections at Hogwarts would be sufficient. And because you thought, he stopped, read Dumbledore's expression with the attention he brought to everything, and said, more carefully, because you thought if anyone tried for it here, they would have to get through you. And you're right about that. But you also thought that if Voldemort tried for it through a proxy, I might be useful in that confrontation. Dumbledore was very quiet. I'm not angry about it, Harry said. I'm telling you that I see it. The plan had a logic. He paused. The problem with the plan is that it treats me as a chess piece and doesn't account for the fact that I've been playing chess since I was 5. Dumbledore said nothing for a moment. Then, quietly, what would you like to do? Tell me everything, Harry said. About Voldemort. About what you think is actually happening with him, not the public version, the real version. About what the fragment in my scar means in the context of your larger theory. And then we can discuss what to do about Quirrell together. The old man looked at him across the desk. There was something in his face that Harry hadn't seen before, not the strategic warmth, not the managed concern. Something older and less calculated. "You know about the fragment," he said. "Since I was 6, Harry said. Gringotts Cursebreakers identified it. I've been managing it for 5 years. A long silence. "I have been carrying a significant weight for a very long time," Dumbledore said, slowly. "Believing I was the only one who understood the full scope of it." "You weren't," Harry said. "You just didn't tell anyone." He met the old man's eyes. "That's the pattern, isn't it? You carry the information because you don't trust anyone else to carry it correctly." Dumbledore looked at him. It was a long look, the kind that went all the way through. "Yes," he said. Quietly and without qualification. "Tell me," Harry said. So Dumbledore told him. Not everything. Harry didn't expect everything, not yet. Trust was built in layers and they were on the first one, but enough. Horcruxes, that term, the theory of soul fracture. The specific horror of what Voldemort had done, the lengths he'd gone to for immortality, the fact that he wasn't simply a very powerful dark wizard but a man who had deliberately mutilated his own soul in pursuit of something he was not going to achieve. Harry listened without interruption, organizing the information into the architecture of everything he already knew. When Dumbledore finished, Harry said, "How many?" Dumbledore paused. "I believe, how many does he need to have made for the magic to work the way you're describing?" "The minimum viable number." 6, Dumbledore said, with the specificity of someone who had spent years on this question. "At minimum. Possibly more." "Objects you've identified?" "Some. The diary was destroyed. There are others I have suspicions about." He paused. "And then there is the question of the fragment in my scar," Harry said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, taking this in, placing it in relation to everything else. "He made me one." "Accidentally." "Yes," Dumbledore said. Harry looked at him. "You've known since the beginning that there's something in me that connects to him. And part of the reason you wanted me isolated and uninformed was because you didn't know what it was going to do to me. Whether I could be trusted with knowing it." Dumbledore was very still. "Partly," he said. "And partly," Harry said, "because whatever your plan for dealing with Voldemort is, it requires the fragment to be addressed. And addressing it would require something from me. Something significant." He looked at Dumbledore directly. "You thought if I knew too much too early I would refuse." The silence was absolute. "Would you have?" Dumbledore asked, very quietly. Harry considered this honestly. "I don't know," he said. "I've had the Gringotts Cursebreakers working on extraction for 2 years. They're making progress. If the fragment can be removed without killing me, and they believe it can, in another year or 2, then whatever sacrifice you were planning for me becomes unnecessary." He paused. "That's the thing you didn't know." Dumbledore looked at him with an expression Harry could only describe as something releasing. "How certain are they?" "Cautiously optimistic," Harry said. "I'm sending you their latest assessment. Ragnarok approved sharing it with you." He reached into his robe and put a folded parchment on the desk. "I want to be clear about something. I'm not here to destroy you. I presented the contract publicly because it needed to be public, because the truth doesn't become less true for being inconvenient. But I don't want to spend my Hogwarts years fighting you. The inquiry will handle the legal side. What I want from you is honesty." Dumbledore looked at the parchment on the desk, then at Harry. "That," he said, "is the most uncomfortable request anyone has made of me in 70 years. "I know," Harry said. "That's why I'm making it instead of something easier." Fawkes made a sound from his perch. Dumbledore glanced at the phoenix, and something moved in the old man's face, something private, between himself and the bird, and then he straightened slightly. "Quirrell," Dumbledore said. I will share everything I know. And I will," he paused, "I will ask that you let me address the situation. He is my responsibility." "He is," Harry said. "But I want to be told when you're moving on it." "Agreed. And I want Ragnarok notified. He has a stake in the stone's security, it was held in his bank." "Also agreed." Harry stood. He looked at Dumbledore one more time, at this man who had made enormous decisions about Harry's life with no authority to make them, who had done it from genuine conviction and genuine love and genuine catastrophic arrogance, who was now sitting across a desk from the 11-year-old he'd tried to hide in Surrey and being asked to be honest. "Same time next month?" Harry said. Something that was almost a smile crossed Dumbledore's face. "I'll have Fawkes deliver the notice." November came in with cold wind and Quidditch tryouts. Harry had signed up because the Slytherin captain had essentially demanded it, having heard about Harry's background, not Quidditch background specifically but the physical training, the reflexes, the spatial awareness, and because Harry had no objection to flying. He'd been on brooms in the Gringotts courtyard 3 times and found it straightforward. Physics with magic added. You read the space, you felt the broom's response, you adjusted. The tryout was in the morning. He caught the snitch 4 times in 20 minutes against the current seeker, who was a 3rd-year named Marcus who was genuinely good and had the specific grace of someone who'd been flying competitively since he was 8. On the 5th catch Harry did it wandlessly, a small levitation assist to himself when he overshot slightly, just enough to correct his angle, the wandless magic so integrated with his flying by that point that it was simply part of how he moved. He didn't think anything of it. Marcus did. "You used something wandless," he said. Not accusatory. Impressed. "Did I?" Harry said. "That's against the rules technically," Marcus said. "The rule says no wands in Quidditch," Harry said. "I didn't use a wand." The captain, a 6th-year named Flint who had all the subtlety of a battering ram and twice the effectiveness, made a sound that suggested he found this argument entirely satisfactory. Harry was on the team. He told Griphook in his next letter. Griphook's reply contained 1 sentence of response to the Quidditch news, "Do not fall off the broom," and 3 paragraphs about the ongoing Sirius Black formal clearing proceedings, which were moving faster now that Copperthorne had filed the Dementor Oversight Challenge alongside the wrongful imprisonment claim. Harry read the 3 paragraphs carefully, noted the dates, wrote back a suggestion about a specific procedural angle that he'd read about in the old Goblin Law book from his trunk. Griphook wrote back 2 days later, "Your procedural suggestion has been incorporated. Copperthorne says," and I am quoting directly, "not bad for an 11-year-old, which from Copperthorne is equivalent to a standing ovation." Harry filed this letter with the others he kept in a locked box at the bottom of his trunk, next to the blades and the bronze mirror and the copy of Goblin Contract Law. Voldemort made his move in December. Harry knew it before it happened, the way he knew most things, through pattern recognition and the specific information his scar provided when he paid attention to it. The fragment in his scar and the fragment in Quirrell's head were connected, and when they came into proximity the resonance increased, and by December 1st that resonance was humming constantly, which meant Quirrell was moving toward action. He sent a letter to Ragnarok. He sent a letter to Griphook. He wrote a brief note and left it on Dumbledore's desk. Then he went down to the 3rd-floor corridor on December 7th, at 11 o'clock at night, because the resonance had gone sharp and he'd felt it from his dormitory like a bell struck too close to your ear, and because he had decided, with the particular clarity of someone who had spent 10 years learning the difference between preparation and waiting, that this was not something he was going to observe from a safe distance. He went alone. Not because he thought backup was unnecessary, he thought backup was almost always useful, but because the situation required someone who understood what they were walking into, and at this particular moment that was him and nobody else. The corridor door was open. He went through it. The first obstacle was a trap door with a giant 3-headed dog behind it who looked at Harry and growled with 3 separate sets of very large teeth, and Harry looked back at it, felt the room's magic, there was music, a harp, playing and keeping the dog drowsy, and said, in Parseltongue, "Stay calm." I'm not here to disturb you. I'm just passing through. The dog blinked. Three heads turned to look at him with the uncertain expression of a creature encountering something unexpected. Good, Harry said, and lifted the trapdoor. He went through the obstacles methodically. The devil's snare was obvious, light charm, wandless, the plants recoiling immediately. The flying keys took 40 seconds, he flew with the ease of someone who'd been training reflexes for a year and caught the right key on the second pass. The troll room was already unconscious, someone had been through here before him, which meant Quirrell was ahead. The chess game, extraordinarily, tried to engage him as a piece, and Harry stood at its edge and said very clearly, I'm not playing. Stand aside, and backed it up with the weight of his magic in a way that wasn't aggressive but was absolute, and the chess pieces, which were old enchantments that responded to magical authority, moved aside. The potions room, logic puzzle, Hermione would have loved it, Harry solved it in 90 seconds from the description on the paper. He stepped into the final room. The mirror of Eriste was there. Quirrell was there, standing before it, turning in frustrated circles, and whatever he'd expected to find or do he clearly hadn't found it yet. And the voice, the second voice, the wrong-note voice that Harry had been sensing for 3 months, the one that lived in the back of Quirrell's head under the turban, said, very quietly, the boy. The boy is here. Quirrell turned. He looked at Harry with wide eyes and then with the specific stillness of a man receiving instructions from something inside him. Harry Potter, Quirrell said, in his stutterless voice. Because the stutter was gone now, and the garlic smell was gone, and what was left was just a man who had opened himself to something terrible and couldn't find the door back out. You should not be here. I know, Harry said. And yet. You don't understand what, Voldemort is in your head, Harry said. Under the turban. He's been there since you let him in during your travels. He's using you to get the stone, and when he's done with you he'll let you die because you're only useful to him while you're functional. He paused. I'm telling you this not to threaten you. I'm telling you because you're a person who made a terrible choice and I think somewhere in there you know it was terrible. Quirrell's face moved, something under the surface, something that was still human and still frightened and had been frightened for a very long time. Then it closed over. Step aside, he said. No, Harry said simply. He wants to speak to you, Quirrell said. The Dark Lord wishes, I know what he wants, Harry said. The answer is no. He looked at the mirror. The mirror, he'd known since Ragnarok told him about the stone's hiding method, showed the user what they most deeply desired, and it hid the stone inside the reflection, accessible only to someone who wanted to find it rather than use it. He looked at his reflection. His mother's eyes looked back at him. His father's face, slightly. His own, mostly. And Ragnarok, standing at his shoulder the way he stood at meetings, straight-backed and formal. And Griphook, arms folded, not looking at the mirror but at the door, watching the approach. And Sirius, actually smiling for once, the real one. His reflection reached into its pocket and took out a stone. He felt it appear in his own pocket. He didn't reach for it. He looked at Quirrell. I have the stone, he said. Dumbledore is on his way. The game is over. Something shifted in Quirrell's face, the human part and the other part fighting for the surface, and then the other part won, and Quirrell said, in a voice that was 2 voices badly superimposed, show it to me. Let me see it. Let me just, no, Harry said again. You would deny me? The second voice was fully present now, not Quirrell's voice at all, the voice of something that had been a man once and had made enough choices that the man was barely visible anymore. I am the greatest dark wizard in a century. You are a child, I am the heir of 4 houses, Harry said. I grew up in Gringotts. I have been prepared for this conversation since I was 9 years old. He looked at where the voice was coming from, the back of Quirrell's head, the turban. You put a piece of yourself in me, he said to it, directly. When your curse rebounded. I've been living with your fragment for 11 years. Silence. You are a better Horcrux than any I made deliberately, the voice said, quieter now, and something in it was, not respectful, exactly. Recognizing. One predator to another. You survived. You grew. You are, not yours, Harry said. I'm removing the fragment. In about a year. Gringotts Cursebreakers have almost solved the extraction. When it's gone, whatever tether exists between us goes with it. He paused. I thought you should know. The silence this time was very different. You came here to tell me that, the voice said. I came here to stop you getting the stone, Harry said. The information was free. Quirrell lunged. He was fast and desperate, and the purple fire that erupted from his hands was genuinely dangerous, and Harry moved, not the wand-first response of a textbook dueler but the full-body, blade-trained movement of someone who'd spent a year learning that your feet decided the fight before your hands did. He stepped to the left, let the fire pass, and hit Quirrell with a shield charm so dense it threw the professor back 6 feet. Quirrell hit the floor and scrambled up, and the purple fire came again. Harry stepped inside it, inside the range, closer than the fire expected, and caught Quirrell's arm. The burning started immediately. He'd known it would. He didn't understand the full mechanism of it, why his touch was fatal to something that had been near Voldemort for too long, but the Cursebreakers had flagged it years ago, the way his magic and the magic of Voldemort's Horcrux-tainted presence repelled each other with catastrophic force. He held on. He held on for exactly as long as it took. Quirrell screamed. The second voice screamed. The fire died. Quirrell collapsed, and the thing that flew out of him, thin, barely visible, like smoke with a face, screamed past Harry in the direction of the door, and Harry felt it pass his scar like a cold blade, and then it was gone, and the room was very quiet. Quirrell was alive. Barely. Breathing, unconscious, alive. Harry reached into his pocket and took out the stone. He looked at it, small, red, warm. The product of Nicholas Flamel's 600 years of work. He set it very carefully on the stone floor, not touching it more than necessary. He sat down on the cold floor next to Quirrell, which was more a decision made by his legs than his head, and pressed the back of his hand to his forehead where the scar was burning hard. All right, he said quietly, to nobody in particular. Behind him, the door opened. Dumbledore came through it, not running, but with the long purposeful stride of someone who had moved very fast to get here, and stopped when he saw the room. He looked at Quirrell on the floor. At the stone on the ground. At Harry sitting next to them both. You're all right, Dumbledore said. It wasn't quite a question. Yes, Harry said. He looked up at the old man. You were close behind me. Closer than you knew, Dumbledore said. There was something in his voice that wasn't the measured control of their Thursday meetings, something rougher. More present. Not close enough. I was fine, Harry said. I know. Dumbledore crouched beside Quirrell, assessed him quickly, stood. He'll survive. He'll need Azkaban, I expect, though the legal questions around his culpability will be. He stopped. Are you certain you're all right? My scar hurts, Harry said honestly. It'll pass. It usually does. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment, the full weight of the look, the one that read everything. I owe you an apology, he said. For this, specifically. I set this up as a trap and you walked into it and handled it better than I would have. You should not have had to do that. No, Harry said. I shouldn't have. He looked at the stone on the floor. Send it back to Flamel. Or destroy it, if he agrees. It's done more harm than good. I will discuss it with him, Dumbledore said. Good. Harry stood, slowly, brushing stone dust off his robes. He picked up the stone and held it out. This is yours to manage. I found it for you. We're even. Dumbledore took it. He looked at Harry with that complicated expression, the one that had been developing since the Wizengamot chamber, grief and recognition and something that had no clean name. Your parents would be, Sirius tells me things about them, Harry said, not unkindly. You can too. Thursday. I'll bring biscuits, yours look ancient. Something that was definitely a laugh moved through Dumbledore before he could stop it. Thursday, he agreed. Harry walked out of the room, through the obstacles in reverse, the chess pieces moved aside again, the devil's snare had retracted, the dog was still half asleep and didn't growl, and out into the normal castle, where the corridors were quiet and cold and entirely, blessedly, ordinarily Hogwarts. He went back to the Slytherin dormitory. He lay in his bed in the dark. His scar ached and then quieted. The fragment in it was still there, and Voldemort's shade was gone into whatever it went between attempts, and the stone was safe, and Quirrell was alive. Not perfect. But real. He looked at the ceiling of the Slytherin dungeon, the greenish light from the underwater windows making slow patterns across the stones, and he thought about the first time he'd looked up at the lamp in the Gringotts medical wing, 15 months old and wondering at the light. He was still doing that, he supposed. Still looking at the light and finding it worth looking at. His eyes closed. He slept. Chapter 6, Blood Debt. The formal inquiry into Albus Dumbledore opened on the 14th of January. Harry wasn't there. He was in Transfiguration, turning a hedgehog into a very precise pincushion, and McGonagall had given him a look that morning that communicated she was aware of what was happening in the Ministry and had made a professional decision to teach her lesson anyway, and Harry had responded with the look of someone who had made the same decision. The inquiry would run its course. He had already given Copperthorne everything it needed. His presence in the chamber would be theatre, and he had very little patience for theatre. The letter from Ragnarok arrived at lunch. It was brief, as Ragnarok's letters always were, Session 1 complete. 23 members present. The contract was entered into formal evidence. Dumbledore did not contest the factual record. He is arguing necessity and emergency authority. Copperthorne is enjoying himself. Progress is measured but real. Come to Gringotts the weekend of the 25th. We should meet in person. Harry read it, folded it, put it in his pocket. Across the table, Hermione was looking at him with the expression she'd developed over the last 4 months, not quite asking, not quite not asking. She had absorbed a considerable amount of context by now. They'd had 3 conversations about the Wizengamot proceedings, 2 about Sirius Black's formal clearing, and 1 very long one about the nature of political power that had started in the library at 8 o'clock and ended when Madame Pants threw them out at closing time. Hermione had gone away from that last conversation with 3 pages of notes and the expression of someone whose worldview had been productively disrupted. Good news or interesting news, she asked now. Both, Harry said. Is there anything I can help with? He'd been thinking about this for a while, about Hermione specifically, about the quality of her mind and the way she approached problems with a combination of academic rigor and genuine moral seriousness that he found more useful than almost anything else in this school. He'd been thinking about what kind of ally she might be compared to what kind of friend she already was, and whether those 2 things were mutually exclusive or whether they were just aspects of the same person. Yes, he said. Actually, I need someone to read through something with me. A legal brief. I want a second pair of eyes on the argument structure. She sat up slightly straighter, in the specific way she did when something engaged her completely. When? Tonight. Library. Fine. She went back to her lunch. Then, you know you're the only first year who uses the library for actual work and not just to look like you're doing work. I know, Harry said. It's a low bar. Ron, on his other side, looked up from his food. Some of us are doing actual work. Just not legal briefs. He paused. What is a legal brief? A document that argues a legal position, Harry said. Right, Ron said. Sounds terrible. It's actually fascinating, Hermione said. It actually is, Harry agreed. Ron looked between them with the expression of someone who had accepted, 3 months ago, that this was his life now, and was mostly fine with it. The weekend of the 25th came and Harry took the flu from the Hogsmeade office. Dumbledore had arranged flu access for him specifically, without being asked, which Harry had noted as a gesture and acknowledged privately as a real one, and arrived in Gringotts' internal network at 9:30 on Saturday morning. The bank smelled the same. Copper and old stone and the particular magic density of a place that had been working at full capacity for 900 years. He stood in the arrival room for a moment and just breathed it. Griphook was there. He was standing with his arms folded and his expression neutral, and he looked Harry up and down with the assessment of someone checking inventory, and then he said, "You grew again." "I do that," Harry said. "It's inconvenient. Your file photo is now inaccurate." He turned and walked, the implied message being, "Keep up. How's the wand work coming along?" "McGonagall says my fundamentals have improved. She uses the word, acceptable, in a tone that means, good. What do you say?" "I say the wandless work is more interesting, but I understand why the foundations matter." He fell into step beside Griphook, and the corridors of Gringotts moved past him, familiar and right in a way that Hogwarts, for all its extraordinary qualities, wasn't quite yet. "How is Sharpclaw?" "Retired last month," Griphook said. "He submitted the paperwork on the 1st. He is fishing, apparently, in Scotland. He sent you a letter." "I got it." Harry had read it 4 times. It was 6 sentences long, which for Sharpclaw was a dissertation. The last line had said, "You were the most unusual thing on my gate in 47 years. I mean this as the highest possible compliment." Harry had put it in the locked box in his trunk. They reached Ragnarok's office. The door was open. Ragnarok was at his desk, as he always was, but he stood when Harry came in, not something he did for most visitors, and Harry had understood for years that the gesture was not ceremony but acknowledgement of something real, that had accumulated over time. You couldn't name it cleanly. Goblin philosophy had a word for it, archdret, the bond between a maker and the thing they'd made significant effort to build well. Harry sat down. "Tell me everything," Ragnarok said. He told him everything. The Quirrell situation, the confrontation in the final chamber, Voldemort's shade, the stone, Dumbledore arriving behind him. He was specific and unsentimental about it, the way he'd learned to report from years of being asked to account for himself clearly. Ragnarok listened without interrupting. When Harry finished, Ragnarok was quiet for a moment. "You held him," Ragnarok said. "Physically. Knowing your magic would harm him." "Yes." "Calculated risk." "Yes." "What was your error margin?" "I was operating on the Cursebreaker's analysis from 2 years ago," Harry said. "The interaction between my magic and Voldemort's Horcrux-tainted presence would produce catastrophic magical repulsion. That repulsion travels through physical contact. I held him long enough to force the separation of Voldemort's shade from Quirrell's body. I didn't know the exact threshold, it was faster than I expected." "Because your magic has grown since the 2-year-old analysis," Ragnarok said. "Yes. I should have updated the risk assessment. I'll know better next time." "There should not be a next time of that particular variety," Ragnarok said. "I mean this." He looked at Harry with the expression that was not warmth in the human sense but was something functionally equivalent and considerably more durable. "You are not expendable. You have never been expendable. I need you to continue to operate as though that is true." "I do operate that way," Harry said. "Going in alone was a calculated choice, not a reckless one. I had the best understanding of the situation of anyone available." "You were 11 years old. You were teaching me ward theory when I was 5, Harry said. "My age is relevant to some things." Ragnock looked at him for a moment. Then he said, Copperthorne wants to discuss the inquiry timeline with you. He's ready when you are. And the scar extraction? Harry asked. The Cursebreakers want to try in June, Ragnock said. Before the summer, while your magic is in a stable period and not under the stress of examination season. The procedure will take 3 days. You'll need to stay here. All right, Harry said. It's not without risk. I know. Less risk than leaving it there. He paused. What happens to the fragment when it's removed? It cannot survive outside a host, Ragnock said. It is not fully coherent enough. When it leaves you, it ends. He met Harry's eyes. The connection between you and Voldemort ends with it. Your Parseltongue may or may not persist. We don't know yet whether it came entirely through the fragment or whether it triggered something dormant in the Slytherin bloodline. We will find out. Harry thought about Corridor 7. About the snake's flat conversational voice and the rat problem in the lower levels. Either way is fine, he said. Copperthorne briefed him for 2 hours. The inquiry was moving on 3 tracks simultaneously: the fraudulent invocation of emergency chief warlock powers, the unauthorized use of Harry's vault funds, and the separate question of Sirius Black's imprisonment, which while not technically part of the original filing was connected enough that Copperthorne had successfully argued it into the same proceeding. The Ministry was fighting a rearguard action on all 3 tracks, sometimes defending Dumbledore directly and sometimes simply trying to slow the proceedings down by generating procedural complexity. They're betting on fatigue, Copperthorne said. On the public appetite for this kind of sustained attention diminishing. Most legal challenges of this nature lose momentum after the initial revelation. People move on. The Ministry benefits from moving on. What stops that happening here? Harry asked. You do, Copperthorne said flatly. Your presence in the Wizengamot is the single most consistent factor keeping this on the agenda. You have 4 seats. You can call for session updates. You can put questions on the formal record. You can make it structurally impossible for the inquiry to be quietly shelved without a formal vote to shelve it, which would itself be a public record. What do I need to do between now and the next session? Copperthorne slid a parchment across the table. These 3 questions need to be formally submitted by the 15th of February. I've drafted the language. Read it, adjust anything that doesn't sound like you, and sign it. Harry read the parchment. He adjusted 2 phrases, signed it, handed it back. Copperthorne looked at the adjusted phrases. His expression shifted in the way that it had when Harry had suggested the procedural angle for Sirius's case, a reluctant acknowledgement that the adjustment was better. You changed the emphasis in the second question. The original framing asks whether Dumbledore knew the emergency provision was inapplicable, Harry said. That's asking him to prove intent, which is harder. My version asks whether Dumbledore verified that the provision was applicable before invoking it, which is asking him to prove process. Process is documented. Or it isn't. Copperthorne said nothing for a moment. Then, you'll be a problem for everyone, won't you? Only the people who are doing things wrong, Harry said. That is a naive assumption, Copperthorne said. Most people doing things wrong believe they are doing them right. I know, Harry said. That's what makes it complicated. He stood. I want to see Sirius's case file too. Is he here today? He is in the waiting room, Copperthorne said. He arrived 40 minutes ago. Sirius had been to Gringotts often enough that the front desk staff recognized him on sight, which he seemed to find both touching and slightly baffling. He was in one of the side chairs off the main hall with a cup of tea that was probably cold, turning it in his hands, and he stood up when he saw Harry come through the doors. He looked better than he had 2 years ago. The Azkaban hollowness was filling in slowly, his eyes had more color, and the shaking hands were mostly gone. He'd moved out of the small bare flat into something larger, shared with Remus Lupin, who Harry had met twice and who was quiet and careful and looked at Harry sometimes with an expression that was simultaneously grief and something that might eventually become joy. "Good trip?" Sirius said. "Good meeting," Harry said. "Copperthorne says the formal clearing should come through by spring." Something moved through Sirius's face, the complicated relief of a person who had been told good news about something they'd been waiting 2 years to resolve, and still didn't entirely trust that it was going to happen. "Spring," he said. "Spring," Harry confirmed. "There's a procedural issue with the evidence assessment that Copperthorne is resolving this week, and then the formal declaration goes to the Wisengamot Family Division for ratification, and then it's done." He paused. "You'll have your name back. Officially." Sirius was quiet. He put his cold tea down. He looked at Harry with the eyes that were James's and not James's, a generation older, worn in different ways, carrying things James never had to carry. "You know James would have," he started, and then stopped, because he always stopped there, at the same place, because whatever came after it was too much and he hadn't found the words yet. "I know," Harry said. "Can I just—" Sirius pulled him into a hug. It wasn't graceful. Harry was not experienced with physical affection as a general category, and Sirius was overly enthusiastic, and it was slightly too tight, and someone's elbow was in a wrong position, and the overall execution was imperfect in several specific ways. Harry hugged him back. After a moment Sirius let go and cleared his throat and looked at a corner of the ceiling. Harry looked at the floor. Both of them performed the specific social ritual of people who had experienced something real and were giving each other the dignity of not commenting on it directly. "Right," Sirius said. "Lunch." "Ragnarok said there's a good place in Diagon Alley." "There are several," Harry said. "Though you should know that my standard of comparison is goblin porridge, so my palate is not the most refined guide." Sirius laughed. "The real one. Merlin, you sound exactly like him sometimes. Just, your mother's voice, your father's cadence." They went to lunch. February came and March went, and Harry's first year at Hogwarts shaped itself around the competing demands of being 11, being exceptional, being the subject of an active legal inquiry, and being in a school run by the person that inquiry was investigating. Dumbledore had, with the particular grace of someone who understood that certain adaptations were necessary, recalibrated. The Thursday meetings continued. They were strange, those meetings, two people who had a complicated history and a contested relationship and a genuine shared investment in several outcomes, working through a slow and deliberate process of information exchange that was neither reconciliation nor its absence. Harry learned things about his parents he hadn't known. Dumbledore learned, he suspected, that he had been fundamentally wrong about what Harry needed in ways he was still processing. "You were afraid I'd be ordinary," Harry said once, in March, with the directness that was just who he was. "That's part of it. You needed me to be what I am. And you were afraid that if I grew up in the wizarding world, surrounded by the mythology of who I was supposed to be, I'd either collapse under it or become something defined by it. You wanted to give me an ordinary childhood so I'd have an ordinary self to build from." Dumbledore looked at him across the desk. "And you think that was wrong?" "I think it was your decision to make and not yours to make," Harry said. "And I think what actually happened was, I got a different education. Not ordinary. But mine." He paused. "I built myself in a bank run by people who told me the truth and taught me that I was responsible for my own value. That's not what you planned. But I don't think you'd argue with the result." Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, "No. I wouldn't." Harry Quidditch games, 2 Wisengamot questions formally submitted, 1 very satisfying charms exam, and a conversation with the snake in Corridor 7 that had covered the rat problem, the cold draft from the North Vault, and, tangentially, a philosophical discussion about the nature of waiting that Harry had found more interesting than expected. The snake had opinions. Considered ones. He still had the Parseltongue in April. That answered that question. Sirius Black was formally cleared on the 9th of April. Harry was there for it. He'd come down from Hogwarts on the Saturday. Dumbledore had given permission without being asked twice, which was its own kind of marker of how things had shifted, and sat in the Wisengamot chamber in the Potter seat with Griphook standing behind him, and watched the Wisengamot family division read out the formal declaration. In the matter of Sirius Black, no formal charges were ever filed. No trial was ever conducted. The emergency detention order of November 1981 has been reviewed and found to have been executed without proper procedural authority. The detention is hereby declared unlawful. The record of Sirius Black is to be expunged of all reference to criminal detention. Reparations in the amount of. Harry stopped listening to the specific numbers. He looked at Sirius, who was sitting 3 seats away in the black seat, and Sirius was looking at the clerk reading the declaration with the expression of someone receiving something they had stopped believing they would receive. When the declaration was complete, the chamber applauded with the formal measured applause of a governmental body, and Sirius turned and looked at Harry, and Harry nodded once. Sirius nodded back. After the session, in the corridor, Remus was there. He hadn't been able to get a seat in the chamber, but he'd been in the public gallery, and the look on his face when Sirius came out was enough to make the witch standing next to Harry take a small quiet breath. Harry gave them space. He walked to the end of the corridor and looked out the window at the grey April London below, the river catching flat light, the ordinary world doing its ordinary things. Griphook appeared beside him. The formal clearing was the last item tied to the original Wardwright filing, he said. From a purely legal standpoint, the structure we built in November 1981 has now accomplished everything it was built to accomplish. Harry looked at him. There was something in that sentence that was specific, deliberate. From a purely legal standpoint, he said. Yes, Griphook said. The inquiry into Dumbledore is separate. Separate and ongoing, Griphook confirmed. Not part of the original Wardwright structure. That proceeds on its own timeline. And the Horcrux situation. Also separate. Long-term. Ragnarok's agenda for years. He paused. What I am saying is that the specific debt, the Wardwright debt, the obligation that was created when you came through our doors, that has been honored. The rest of what we're doing because it's right. Not because we owe it. Harry looked at him. Is there a difference? In law, sometimes, Griphook said. In practice, he paused, with the specific pause of a goblin selecting words carefully, no. But it's worth knowing which is which. So you know that what continues now continues by choice. Harry looked back out the window. Good, he said. June arrived. The scar extraction took 3 days, as advertised. Harry spent those 3 days in the Gringotts medical wing in the same room he'd been brought to 11 years and 7 months ago, which was either poetic or coincidental, and he wasn't sure which. The Cursebreakers were a team of 4, Flintedge, who was the lead, small and ancient and moved with the precise economy of someone who had done extremely delicate work for 2 centuries, 2 juniors named Goldmantle and Sharpstone who did the support work, and Iron Teeth, who was there in her medical capacity and who had been present at the beginning and had apparently decided she was going to be present at the end. The procedure was not comfortable. Harry had been told this and had accepted it as a fact and found that the reality of it exceeded the telling, which was usually the way with pain. It was categorical rather than descriptive. He lay still and breathed through it and thought about the courtyard with the grated ceiling and the thin squares of London sky, and about Corridor 7 and the snake with its flat practical voice, and about the vaults in the deep dark and the way old magic felt on his skin. On the second day the scar flared and his head ached badly enough that Iron Teeth had given him something for it, and he'd slept for 6 hours and dreamed nothing, and woken up feeling scraped clean. On the third day Flintedge said, "Hold very still," in the specific voice of someone who was at the critical phase of something, and Harry held very still, and there was a sensation like something pulling free from the inside of his skull, not violent, not catastrophic, just a release, a loosening, like a splinter finally out, and then it was over. The room felt different. He felt different. Not emptier. That was what he'd expected, an absence. Instead it was more like a frequency that had always been present had stopped, and in the silence of it he could hear everything else more clearly. Flint Edge held up the containment vessel, a small bronze sphere with wards carved into every surface, and inside it was something barely visible. A thread of darkness, barely coherent, moving sluggishly against the bronze walls. "That's it?" Harry said. "That is it," Flint Edge said, with the satisfaction of completing an extremely long project. "What remains of it will dissipate within 24 hours. The containment is to ensure it does so safely." Harry looked at the bronze sphere. At the thread of Voldemort in it, drifting. "Destroy it," he said. "When it's gone." "Standard procedure," Flint Edge confirmed. Iron Teeth came forward and looked at the scar. She hadn't touched it since the first night. Now she examined it with her instruments and her eyes and finally said, with the specificity of a healer reporting facts, "The wound is closed. Clean. There will be a scar, there's been a scar for 11 years, that's not changing. But the magical activity is gone. There is nothing in it. Just a scar," Harry thought. Just a shape on his skin that had been made by an extraordinary thing and was now just history. "Good," he said. Ragnarok was in the doorway. Harry hadn't heard him come in, but he was there, standing with his hands behind his back, and his expression had the quality it got at significant moments, not emotion in the human sense, but presence. Attention brought fully forward. "How do you feel?" Ragnarok asked. Harry thought about it honestly. "Lighter," he said. "But not smaller. Just, the thing that was in the way is gone." Ragnarok nodded once. "The Parseltongue is still there, for the record," Harry said. "I asked the corridor snake this morning. She said hello." Something moved across Ragnarok's face that was definitely, if you knew how to read it, and Harry did, something very close to laughter. "Of course she did," he said. The inquiry reached its conclusion in September, just before Harry's second year began. Not a criminal verdict, the Wisengamot was not a criminal court, and the inquiry had been explicitly procedural rather than punitive. What it produced was a formal censure, which was a specific instrument of Wisengamot judgment that carried significant weight, a public record, entered into the permanent archive, of misconduct in office. Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, chief warlock of the Wisengamot, was formally censured on 3 counts. Improper invocation of emergency authority. Unauthorized use of a minor's estate funds. Failure to properly notify named guardians before initiating guardianship transfer. The censure did not remove him as chief warlock. The vote for removal failed by 7 seats, which Harry had expected. Dumbledore was genuinely beloved, genuinely powerful politically, and genuinely trusted by people who had good reason to trust him. The censure was not a defeat. It was something different, a line drawn on the record. A permanent, visible mark on the account of a man who had operated for decades as though the rules were for other people. The story ran in the Daily Prophet on September 3rd. Harry read it over breakfast at the Slytherin table on the first morning of his second year, and then set it down and had more toast. "That's it?" Draco said, from across the table. He'd read it over Harry's shoulder and his expression communicated a certain dissatisfaction with the outcome. "That's not nothing," Harry said. "It's not removal," Draco said. "Removal wasn't the goal," Harry said. "Visibility was. Everyone in the wizarding world now knows, permanently and on the public record, that Dumbledore used his authority for a purpose it wasn't meant for and that it affected a child. That knowledge changes what he can do next. Every time he tries to act outside his authority from now on, someone will point to that record." He picked up his pumpkin juice. "It's not fire. It's a constraint. Constraints are often more useful." Draco thought about this. He was better at thinking than he'd been a year ago, something that had happened between first and second year, a kind of settling into his own mind. Your mother would say the same thing, Harry had told him, once, and Draco had gone quiet in the specific way he did when Harry mentioned Narcissa, which was a form of complicated love that he wore awkwardly because Malfoys didn't talk about love much. When do you meet with Ragnock? Draco asked. Saturday. What's the next thing? Voldemort, Harry said simply. The other Horcruxes. Dumbledore and I are working on it together, which is still occasionally strange. And there's the Wizengamot seat question. The Slytherin seat is generating some political noise from people who think an 11-year-old shouldn't hold the oldest hereditary seat in the chamber. We need to address that formally before it becomes a procedural challenge. You could just be in school, Draco said, with the tone of someone testing a concept they don't quite believe. You know. Study. Quidditch. Normal things. I do those things, Harry said. Between the legal strategy and the dark object hunting. People contain multitudes, Harry said. Ron, who had sat down halfway through this conversation, said, Did you just quote something? Whitman, Hermione said, from 2 seats down. Loosely. I grew up in a bank, Harry said. Griphook believed in broad reading. What's Griphook reading now? Ron asked, in the tone of someone who had accepted that asking follow-up questions about goblins was simply part of his life. He sent me something last week about pre-goblin rebellion land law, Harry said. It's dense, but there's a section on original property rights that has implications for 3 current inheritance disputes I'm watching. Ron stared at him. You're 12. Yes, Harry agreed. Hermione made a sound that was half exasperation and half affection and was, by now, the sound of someone who had accepted that Harry Potter was a specific kind of person and that this was permanently going to be her life and was, in the balance, fine with it. That Saturday, Harry stood at the top of the Gringotts steps and looked at Diagon Alley for a long moment before going in. The morning was clear and cool, the alley busy with end-of-summer shopping, people moving in and out of shops, children his age with their parents, owls in the post office window. Ordinary magical life, doing what it always did, continuing. He'd been standing on these steps, in some form, his whole life. First as an infant in Ragnock's arms, then as a small child peering out from behind Griphook's shoulder, then alone, then with Sirius, then with the full contingent of goblins walking to the ministry. Every time he stood here the view had been the same alley and he had been a different version of himself. He was 12 now. The scar on his forehead was just a scar. The fragment was gone. The inquiry was resolved. Sirius was cleared. The vaults of 4 houses were open to him, and he'd been through all of them now, Potter, Black, Peverell, Slytherin, and the history in those vaults was real and vast and his, in the way that inherited things were yours even when you hadn't made them. He thought about November 1st, 1981. He thought about a child who had been 15 months old and bleeding and burning and had crawled across cobblestones because that was all there was, just the next stone, just the next inch of distance towards somewhere that wasn't where the bad thing had happened. He thought about the goblin who had looked down at him in the rain. He pushed the doors open and went in. Ragnock was at his desk. He was always at his desk. Harry sometimes wondered if he left it, whether there was a version of Ragnock that existed outside the context of the work, somewhere in the goblin residential areas deep in Gringotts where Harry had never been, and had concluded that the question itself was probably a category error. Ragnock wasn't defined by the desk. The desk was simply where the work was, and Ragnock was always where the work was. He looked up when Harry came in. The look that Harry knew now the way he knew most things about this place, completely, in the way of things deeply familiar. Sit, Ragnock said. Harry sat. The inquiry, Ragnock said. I read the outcome, Harry said. 3 censure counts. No removal. I think it's the right result for now. The right result for now is a phrase that contains a great deal of future work, Ragnock said. Most things do, Harry said. Ragnock looked at him. In the years they had been meeting like this, in this office, at this desk, two very different people conducting the specific relationship that had formed between a goblin who had opened a door in the rain and the child who had been on the other side of it. Ragnarok had changed in the ways that things changed slowly, less visible from the inside than from a distance. He was not softer. Goblins didn't go soft. But there was a quality in the meetings that had accumulated, layer on layer, that wasn't professional anymore. Hadn't been purely professional for years. The Cursebreaker's final report on the scar extraction was filed yesterday, Ragnarok said. Clean extraction confirmed. No residual presence. The connection is severed. He paused. Voldemort is functionally inaccessible to you through magical means. His ability to influence you through the fragment is gone. I know, Harry said. I can tell. The Horcrux investigation continues, Ragnarok said. Dumbledore has identified two more probable objects. He is sharing information, which I will acknowledge is more than I anticipated 6 months ago. He keeps surprising me, Harry said. Not approvingly, not disapprovingly. Just accurately. He is adaptable, Ragnarok said. He adapted to you. That took courage. He will not admit this, but it did. Harry thought about the Thursday meetings, about Fawkes making that low sound when Harry came in, about the biscuit tin that had been replaced sometime in February with a new one that had actual biscuits in it. Small things. Real ones. What's next? Harry asked. Ragnarok picked up a file. The Peveril Vault contains objects that need formal cataloging. Some of them have historical significance beyond their monetary value and I want them assessed properly. The Slytherin Vault has a section that remains sealed that we haven't been able to open. Your access as heir should allow it now that the fragment is removed. The seal may have been reacting to the foreign presence in your magic. He set the file down. And there are the political questions. Your Wizengamot seats are attracting attention. You need to use them actively in the next session or the procedural challenge will gain traction. I have a question prepared, Harry said. About the Azkaban oversight structure. If Sirius could be held for 2 years without trial, the mechanism that allowed it is still functional. Someone else could use it. Ragnarok looked at him. That is a larger fight than the Dumbledore inquiry. Most important fights are larger than the one you just had, Harry said. You are 12 years old, Ragnarok said, with the tone of a man who was aware this point was technically relevant and practically limited in application. You were teaching me ward theory when I was 5, Harry said. That argument keeps working and I find it annoying, Ragnarok said. Harry smiled. Not the careful controlled expression he wore in public, in the Wizengamot, in the halls of Hogwarts where people were always watching and always reading. The real one, simple and unguarded, the smile of someone in a place they were completely comfortable in. I want to go to the vaults this afternoon, he said. The Slytherin Vault. The sealed section. The Cursebreakers will need to be present for the opening. That's fine. Ragnarok stood. After lunch, he said. There are things to discuss first. He moved to the window, the same window he'd been standing at the morning Dumbledore had come, 11 years ago, and looked out over the roof of Diagon Alley, the grey London sky, the ordinary world above and the deep extraordinary world below. You know, he said, and his voice had the quality it sometimes got in the late meetings, when the work was done and the formality had settled, less constructed, more direct. When you arrived at this door, I thought it was a legal matter. An obligation. A ward right debt to be honored. Harry looked at him. I thought it for approximately 4 months, Ragnarok said. By the time I realized it had become something else, it had been something else for quite a while. He turned from the window. I want you to know that. Whatever the legal structure says, Ward of Gringotts, account holder, heir Potter, the legal structure is the scaffolding. It is not the building. Harry held his gaze. He'd known this for years, in the way you knew things that were simply true and didn't require articulation. But there was something about hearing it said in Ragnar's voice, precise and deliberate, chosen with the care that goblins brought to words that mattered, that placed it in the record. Made it part of the permanent account. "I know," Harry said. "I've known for a long time." Ragnar nodded once. The nod that meant, acknowledged, correct, moving on, but that carried everything in it. "Lunch," he said. "And then the vault." They rode the cart together in the late afternoon, Harry and Ragnar and Griphook and the two curse breakers, going down through the levels that Harry knew by name now, past the vault corridors that had been his geography since he was 4 years old, deeper into the old dark where the magic got dense and the air changed temperature. The Slytherin vault was on the 9th level, which was one below the deep historical archive and one above the place where the mountain pressed closest to the foundations and the oldest magic lived. The door was different from the other vault doors, older, carved, the goblin iron worked with serpent motifs that were not decorative but functional, part of the warding. Harry placed his hand on the door. The door recognized him in the way the old magic did, not as a key in a lock but as something more fundamental, a question asked and answered in the language of blood and lineage and the accumulated magical weight of 1,000 years of a family's history. It opened inward with the slow inevitability of something that had been waiting. He walked in. The main vault he'd seen before, the gold, the artifacts, the particular darkness of Slytherin accumulation. But the sealed section was at the back, behind a second door that had stayed closed on his previous visits, and it opened now at his touch. Inside was a library. Not a trophy room, not a weapons cache, not the dark object collection that wizarding rumor had always associated with Slytherin's vault. A library. Thousands of volumes on stone shelves, organized with the precision of someone who had understood that knowledge was the most valuable thing to preserve. Some of the volumes were in scripts Harry recognized, some in scripts he didn't, some in what looked like very old forms of English and Latin and something else entirely. In the center of the room was a single stone chair, and on a low table beside it was a book, separate from the shelves, placed as though waiting. Harry picked it up. The cover was plain. No title. He opened it. The handwriting inside was cramped and old and in a mix of languages, but his eyes adjusted and the magic of the air recognition that the door had performed seemed to extend to the text, because after a moment he could read it. "If you are reading this," the first line said, "then you are what I hoped for and did not expect to see in my own lifetime. Heir of my line, carrying the language of serpents, child of all 4 founders' bloodlines, because yes, I knew the Peverils, and yes, I knew what the mixing of those lines would eventually produce, you are what this collection was preserved for. I am Salazar Slytherin. I have been dead for 900 years. This library is my actual legacy, not the chamber, not the monster, not the blood politics that my name became attached to long after I had no ability to correct the record. Sit down. We have a great deal to discuss." Harry looked at the chair. He looked at the book. He looked at the shelves, thousands of years of knowledge, waiting. He sat down. Outside, in the vault corridor, Griphook heard the faint sound of pages turning, and he smiled, the real one, small and sharp, the one he'd developed about 3 months into being Harry Potter's account manager, and he leaned against the wall and settled in to wait. Above them, in Ragnar's office, the ledgers were being balanced. The accounts were being reconciled, numbers set against numbers in the long patient work of keeping the record accurate. The permanent record that could not be changed, that witnessed what had happened and held it, that was the foundation of everything. In the record, there was an entry dated November 1, 1981. Unidentified child, brought to door, ward right invoked. Senior authority, Ragnar, Chief Vault Master. Below it, in the same hand, added much later but in the same ink, Hadrian James Potter. Ward. Account holder. Heir to 4 houses. Resident of Gringotts Bank, 1981 to 1991. And below that, in handwriting that was smaller and more recent and that the archivist had filed without comment because Gringotts records were thorough and inclusive and the permanent account contained everything, he came back. He always comes back. That is the nature of what was built here. The vaults hummed in the deep dark. The magic moved through the walls, old and steady and entirely indifferent to the specific dramas of human history, doing what it had always done, holding, preserving, remembering. Waiting for the next chapter.